Thank you. If you look on the third column here, which would be the Chinese debt relative to GDP, the median goes from about less than 1% to about 5% by 2015. More importantly, if you compare this in terms of looking at the external bond debt that these countries hold, there's the ratio of this debt to that. It goes from basically being very marginal to being about 2/3 of the debt now. So China is really a major player, and their debt is really sizable and may have consequences for the bond market debt. I'm flashing this because data stops in 2017, but you can already notice a little bit of a dip in some of these portions. I think post-COVID, before COVID and post-COVID, there's been a little bit of a dip and slowing down in sort of this growth of Chinese lending. So, but for us today, I think it's not just beyond the size. I think it's the nature of Chinese loan contract that we found very interesting. Chinese loans just differ fundamentally from other official loan creditors. The literature has documented some very clear seniority privileges written into those contracts, confidentiality clauses akin to maybe not sharing the details of the loan contract with other lenders. Obviously, we've heard about the collateral clauses where the country is pledging other assets, other goods, and other access. And also, Chinese lenders have sort of this unique power provision in the contract to sometimes not only extend and lengthen the loans, but also accelerate the payments. So we think of that from the perspective of sort of sovereign debt and sovereign debt pricing as a unique form of rollover risk. Today, I will try to tell you that one way to possibly think about that is thinking of it as rollover risk without default risk, because it's just harder to walk away from China and not pay it back. We're going to use the model later to tell you that maybe potentially you can think of it as a unique source of geopolitical power in the form of being able to exercise this form of unilateral rollover privilege. So more specifically, what do? We ask how do such non-defaultable rollover-prone official loans from China can affect a country's market borrowing. So this is the borrowing vis-a-vis international private lenders, the sovereign debt and their default risk, and how that can potentially reshape the global architecture of sovereign bonds. Specifically, we're going to use a model, a standard sovereign default model with long-term debt. We will add on top of the standard model a very, very stylized way of thinking on Chinese-style loans. There's a lot of uncertainty about mountain things. I'm going to do a very simple way, closer enough to the canonical model so that we can maybe understand what this is buying us. It's going to be a subsidized loan, it's going to be non-defaultable, and it's going to be an exogenous rollover risk. We're going to think that China is supplying these loans and the countries are taking them. In equilibrium, they will choose to do so, but that's sort of the baseline model. What's our main finding? The main finding, in a way, from a sort of sovereign debt market perspective for us is that Chinese loans induce a unique form of disciplining effect. When countries receive Chinese inflows, the theory suggests that because these loans are non-defaultable and therefore predict that in the future you'll have to pay back, the countries choose to actually lower their market reliance today in anticipation of those future repayments, and today enjoy lower spread. This is actually consistent with some of the empirical evidence we have using data from the countries that are borrowing from China. We finally use the model to say, well, is it always all good? And we do two counterfactual exercises. The first one is from the lender's perspective. Can China entice a country in a way to choose either a sizable loan from China that follows with this risk embedded altogether and never go back to the market? So you're choosing between China and the market. So this is not two hegemons. This is just China versus the market. This is the way in which we can call strategic block formation. The second exercise is going to be one where we say, well, suppose China is not always going to be around. For many reasons, China may have to retrench. How often, and therefore you have to basically pay back and move away from China. How much of an exposure of China would you choose to do, and what are the characteristics of that? So we'll use those two things to talk about how China can potentially shape a global capital market. So let's get to the model. It's a small open economy, discrete time, an exogenous endowment process. So far, nothing new. As I said, it's a standard long-term debt model. So we're going to have a long-term debt with coupon payments that are decaying at rate delta. Costly default costs, you have income losses when you default, and you have temporary exclusion, and you re-enter with no debt. Our lenders are risk neutral, and they will be discounting at an interest at a rate R. The bottom, and now we have the China block. So far, nothing, income is fluctuating, you're borrowing to smooth consumption, and sometimes you choose to default. In a very stylized way, we're going to introduce debt vis-a-vis China as this very simple object, B sub C for China. It can take two values, L for low and H for high. This is going to follow an exogenous Markov process. Think of it as this is a China-driven process. So an inflow is when it goes from low to high, and outflow when it goes from high to low. The transition between from low to high is governed by this probability pi. In the benchmark, this is symmetric. It doesn't, so you're equally likely to go up or down. We have done things where it's asymmetric and so on. So that's pi in a way, and the pi H and L constitute sort of this China income process that you're having on top of your endowment process. The loans are non-defaultable in the sense that when H comes due, you pay it back, including when you're in default on capital market. The loans are subsidized, and in the stylized way I'm going to put it in here is that the L I'm going to set to 0. So you get H, you pay nothing for a while, and then you pay back H, and so on. We've done modifications of this in the paper, but that's the way I'll show it to you today. So in that sense, pi here governs both, sort of think of it as a rollover frequency and the expected maturity of the H inflow you get. You can also think of it as maybe the terms of the contract are not clear. Maybe we didn't even know the time of the repayment that's unknown. Pi could capture as well. Broadly speaking, I want you to think of pi as capturing this uncertainty about the timing and size of outflows and inflows vis-a-vis China. Okay? So what's the government problem in this setup? The government basically has a plan to whether default or repay and choose its issuance on bond market. So the state here is going to be the usual bond market, B, the stock of debt vis-a-vis China, which is either A, L, or H, and sort of this addition, and S, which just contains income Y, and sort of the switching of whether you basically are receiving, you now have to pay back or not. Standard default choice, D equal 1 means you're defaulting, D equals 0 means you're repaying. What is the budget constraint looking like when you're choosing to repay? So you maximize, you're choosing your new debt B prime. The continuation here, let's note that this expectation is S prime given S. This contains not just fluctuations in future income, but it also contains the fluctuations in your Chinese debt position, whether or not you have to repay back China. So you can go from L and stay at L, or L to H, and that's included in this transition. Conditional repaying, you make your coupon payment, you have your exogenous income Y. This is your net debt issuance, 1 minus delta remaining, you issue B prime. This is the new under, this is the equilibrium, this is the price you face for issuing B prime under state B prime. B prime here is just is the new debt. You could use B prime just is simply your China position tomorrow. And this red block is going to be your China inflow. So you have your China's net outflow. It may be flat, it may be 0 for a while. Eventually it's going to turn up, or it's going to go negative, and the B prime fluctuates. And otherwise, when you're in default, you have your usual default cost, but you still have to pay back China. And then you may re-enter. Standard model, we're just adding this block, which is the China net flows. And let me also add, I was having a conversation with Carolina earlier. A lot of people have talked about the fact that some of these loans are for infrastructure. They may change input. They may change sort of the size of the country. You can think of those as potentially maybe there's a one-time level shift into the Y. Because we're assuming that you're not paying back, there's an implicit net present value of not paying the market value for the loan you're getting. Think of, at some point, I will decompose the difference between the two. So think of that as going in a little bit on the net present value gain of getting these China inflows. But we're not going to talk about that today. So very simple and standard problem so far. So in this setup, we have a standard looking pricing of the debt, whereby if you're issuing debt B prime in state S, now that is conditioned also on sort of the China debt stock you have, BC prime, right? So I'm looking at, I'm issuing B prime for tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll have a position H or L, that's the second argument. How do prices vary? Well, obviously, you know, the standard discount, discounting. Here we have the expectation across, again, income fluctuations tomorrow, but also fluctuations in China debt position that will basically shape whether or not you choose to default in those states tomorrow. So we can already see that the repayment probability is also going to change with respect to these Chinese fluctuations. And since this is a long-term debt, you have the future debt prices that also are going to basically be reflecting future repayment choices. So BC prime, sort of these future Chinese debt positions are affecting both sort of tomorrow's default probabilities, but also through future policies, the dilution risk. So as I said, it's a very simple model. How far does it take us in understanding the effect of these Chinese fluctuations on bond market? To do that, we're going to put some numbers on it and see a few things about the bond pricing function and others. So it's a relatively standard calibration, CRI utility gamma equal 2. We're going to have an ARR process in long income. We're going to choose the default cost to target a mean debt to GDP in the sample we use later in NBER, which is about 30% debt to GDP, and a spread about at around 55 basis points. The China lending block is the one we want, but also the one we don't know a lot about. So what do we do? As I said earlier, we are choosing to, we are setting this L to 0. So no coupon payments, you pay nothing, and then you pay back. We have done a few robustness to that, but think of it as the simplest way of doing it. How do we set up the H? The data is noisy. Thanks to Christoph and others, we're learning more about it. What we choose to do is that we measure sort of the flows in China, sort of changes in China debt position. Think of it as the flows that the countries are experiencing in the data in terms of inflows coming from China. And we just choose to go with the highest we see. So this is about 0.05% of GDP. So you have nothing and you get a big bump and you go back, okay? What's the probability of this event happening? Essentially, it's 10%. So the expected maturity of this H, think of it as 10 years. We're going to calibrate to a 5-year long-term bond, but these loans are just going to have a profile about 10 years. The rest of the parameters are relatively standard. So what do we learn? So what we see here is, so as I said, we calibrated to 30% of GDP and 350 basis points, about 350 basis points, which map into about 3% default probability. These next two columns, the blue and the red, are showing us what happens when you receive an inflow in the model versus when you receive an outflow in the model. Result number one is that you see that these countries, when they're receiving inflows, they actually do less of a market debt, they issue less on the market, as opposed to when they have outflows, they borrow more from the market. They consume much less during outflows and consume a little more during inflows. This maps into about 40 basis points lower spread during inflows and about 50 basis points higher relative to the baseline spread during outflows. Notice that the difference between default probabilities and spreads is much larger during inflows versus outflows, 2.1% versus about 100 basis point difference here. So if you go back to our pricing of the debt formula, we had the default risk block and the dilution risk block, suggesting that when you're receiving these inflows, dilution concerns are pretty large. One note on the asymmetric consumption, the fall we see in outflows during repayment, where you have to repay China, is much larger than the increase you get when you get the inflow. And this is despite the fact that they are actually issuing more debt during those periods to repay back the Chinese lender. In the model, the way this works is because in order to basically smooth consumption further, they will have needed to issue more, but the prices endogenously are working against them. And it's precisely because of that concern that earlier on, when the inflows arrive, you try to create fiscal space by basically lowering your debt so that when the repayment happens, you can basically, you have a little bit of a better consumption smoothing. So as I said, in equilibrium, we see that during China inflows, spreads are lower. But this is actually not completely trivial, because if I show you the pricing function here, on the x-axis, I'm showing you next period debt. On the y-axis, I show you spreads. The dashed red line is basically the pricing function when you are awaiting an inflow. So whereas the blue line is you just got an inflow, and therefore your status is BC prime equal H. We can see that the solid blue line is above the dashed red line, because once you have a liability vis-a-vis China, the market is pricing the fact that you may have to pay back, and therefore you may have to tap the market for that. So that means that at any point, suppose you are here 32 on the dash red, and the inflow comes. If you don't do anything, you actually face higher spreads. What we see is that if you look at this red dot, the country is basically borrowing more when it has an outflow and borrowing much less when it has an inflow. And so the lower spread doesn't come from the fact that the pricing schedule is lower. In fact, it's because the pricing schedule is higher and steep on the other end that you fall back. And that's what we call the disciplining effect. I'm going to skip this and try to unpack a little bit more in a different way the same disciplining effect, okay? So another way to look at the disciplining effect for us is basically to think about our low versus medium versus high income state of the world. What we see here in this table, I'm showing you how much debt borrowing you're doing for different levels of income, about average, a little higher and a little lower, during inflows, outflows. And for comparison, we're thinking about, you can look at this in a model where you don't have the China fluctuations happening. As you can see, you borrow in a no China world, the last column, we see that you tend to borrow more in good times because you have more resources, less likely to default. Bad times, you don't do as much. Notice that when the countries are facing these outflows, they are very sensitive. So when you're facing an outflow, income is good, you borrow a lot more into the market, a lot more compared to, let's say, the gradient you have for no China. And you borrow more also when you have an outflow in bad state of the world, but not as much as in high state. Now look at the inflows when they get an inflow. The disciplining effect is causing them to go down, and in a way, that borrowing is less sensitive to your current income, right? Because not freeing that space, the counterfactual of sort of borrowing a little more, even in the high Y state, will beget higher prices if you were to face an outflow in the future vis-a-vis China, okay? So that's another way to look at it. Another way to sort of think about the disciplining effects is also just to go back and say, well, if we were to do a welfare effect, how can we try to isolate the disciplining effect? So what we do here is that we take our model, I'm going to call it benchmark, and so we know the value function you have in the benchmark economy. We are going to compare that benchmark economy to the no China economy. So this is essentially the benchmark long-term debt exogenous output fluctuations economy. In between the two models, we're going to stick what we think of it as, we're going to strip out effectively the net present value of sort of these subsidized loans you're effectively getting from China. So imagine you gave the country the net present value of sort of the extra interest payment they didn't have to make because the loan is subsidized. So we call that the pure subsidy gain. And then we compare that value, right, to sort of and then you have the no China economy. The question for us is how big are these so-called disciplining gains over and above the fact that at the margin, these loans are also just making you wealthier and you have a higher permanent income in a way. So on this graph, on the x-axis, I'm showing you different income states. Y is one being the mean, and on the y-axis, I'm basically giving you these welfare gains. We know in this model they're not very large, but what I want you to see is that the solid black line is the total welfare effect. The red line is basically this pure subsidy effect, right? And it's less and less valuable. It's not as high when you're in high income. But the solid blue line is sort of the effect that's coming from the disciplining, the fact that you're able to you borrow less, you enjoy dynamically lower prices. How valuable is that? Well, it's not small. They run from about half of the overall effect to about a little less than that, maybe a third, so between a quarter and a third. So by saying that, I'm taking the ratio between the dashed blue line and the solid black line. So I think so far what I've showed you is like, well, this type of income process seems to sort of be changing the behavior of the borrowing countries on international capital market. It's valuable because it has a net present value income effect, but it's also valuable because it's actively changing the pricing of the debt and how much you borrow and when you default. Does this hold water? What's the empirical evidence, or what does the data say about this? The way we choose to go about it is that we're going to take sort of the data on Chinese lending stocks, flowing from the work from Sebastian, Chris, and Carmen. We basically just construct long-term bond yield for bonds of at least 5-year maturity, just re-aggregating from bond level data. We collect data, macro variables from the World Bank and others, in particular external public debt. We are careful to also just collect other aid flows and assistance flows they get from the Paris Club or the DAC countries and others, so that it's not, in a way, both to differentiate, but also to control for those other loan supply shifters. We define in the data, when we do this exercise, a China funding event and an inflow as a relatively an above median inflow from that country from China, as long as it's not too small. What I mean by that, you have to be, if the country doesn't get a lot of flows, it's epsilon. I don't want epsilon over 2 to epsilon to be an inflow. So it has to be high enough. And otherwise, we call that a China funding event. And so we basically just have this simple empirical specification. We basically ask, how do China funding events correlate with external log external market debt? And also, how do they correlate with sovereign bond yields? One of the things we do is that we actually work hard in a symmetric way to construct other funding events using the other flows as well. But I'm going to focus today in this presentation on these two coefficients. The quantity is effect, and effect. I'm not claiming any deep causality here. It's just a correlation and the pricing effect. So this table shows that it's showing us sort of the regression when we use the log quantities. So I'm going to show you just a couple of specifications. Column number 1, again, the dependent variable is log external market debt. Column number 1 is just having time fixed effect. We have country fixed effects. And then the second row, as I mentioned earlier, it looks in the data that the size of the shock, it may be tapering and the nature may be changing. So we focus on the initial onset of this China inflows. What do we see? We find that we have about 7 log point reductions in log external bond market debt around China funding events, and that at the onset the effect is actually much larger. On the pricing effect, we have, as we run the similar specification. The sample size is smaller. We don't have as many countries and as many observations in terms of bond prices, and we have about 50 basis point reduction in yields, and again here a much larger effect, of 140 basis point effect on bonds. So how does this number compare to the model I showed you? Well, we had 350 basis points in the baseline in terms of spread. We had 40 basis points lower around inflows, 40, 50. I'm not claiming that's doing a good job or a bad job, but in terms of direction, it seems to be going in the same direction. This is not suggestive. So while this is suggestive evidence that the way we are modeling things maybe are working the data, this doesn't have to be true. In the paper, we show that if you could default on China, this whole thing can unravel. So once you have a China block, and if you could default on China and the market, now you have more debt vis-a-vis another second lender that can force you to default on both the lender and the market. Those things can unravel. But let me use the remainder of my time to sort of use this model to think about a couple of geopolitical counterfactuals, since that's the theme of the day and the times. We consider 2 counterfactuals that we think plausible exercises. One is from the lender's perspective. It will be China. We think of it as a strategic financial block formation exercise. China is going to make a take it or leave it offer. The take it or leave it is very simple. Accept H and leave the market, or you don't take H and you stay with the market alone. The name of the game for us is, how high does H have to be for the country to prefer to accept this deal? And what's the contour in terms of country's patience, impatience, volatility, likelihood of default in terms of accepting this deal? The second exercise is from the borrower's perspective. China, relationships may not be forever. Or, there could be another suitor, or there could be things can go wrong. So we call this the China retrenchment risk. We basically take our baseline model, add on top of it a probability, we call it PSS, SS for sudden stop, for a permanent sudden stop vis-a-vis China. What is this sudden stop? You have to pay back the H and the cards are tied. So it's as if you have a one-time outflow back to China and you revert back into the baseline world. So setting PSS to 0 will be our benchmark model. The question we ask there is, if you're a country that already has debt market B, and you're facing this probability PSS, how much of this China risk do you want to take on? So let me get into the block formation exercise. As I explained, you're comparing sort of the value of China alone versus the market alone. So this is the H you get from China, and there's no B anymore because there's no market. And this is the no China, sort of the standard sovereign debt default model we will know. So this is a race between the two. What are we solving for? We are solving for the lowest H such that you prefer China only. Okay? And we do this, and we're going to compare that across a few country fundamentals in terms of impatience, income volatility, default cost, and income. What's the takeaway? In the interest of time, I'm just going to sort of focus on the bullet points at the bottom. More patient countries are more likely. It takes a lower amount to basically flip countries that are impatient. It takes a lower amount to basically have countries that are more volatile in income process to flip. Countries that are more likely to default and already facing higher spread on the market, same thing. And across the board, countries that are in higher income states are less likely to basically accept the deal for the same amount of age. So we think of this as meaning that if China were to have a cost minimizing strategic block formation exercise, we should see China targeting low income period, less patient government, more volatile in countries, and countries that are basically more face higher default risk on the market. This is actually not completely at odds with some of the evidence in the data. Catherine Casanova, Chiruti, and Pradhan have a really nice working paper. We use a different data set. These are sort of bank loans that are made by China and Chinese entities. And some of these things seem to line up with the profiles they get. What is this retrenchment risk talk we have been having? See, this is actually not, we didn't make it up. Chinese lending declines, leave Africa with huge infrastructure gap. Chinese now the biggest debt collector in the world, peak repayment, Chinese global. There's been talk about the retrenchment for a lot of reasons. And so, Christoph and others have also documented this slowdown. So what we do, as I said, we're going to introduce sudden stop probability. I think I talked about it about already. So the main question for us is ex ante, if you have how much of an H, we had set it as a fixed number in the baseline model. Do you want it higher? Do you want it lower? And how does that change depending on how much you owe and the probability of a sudden stop? This is the upshot. Essentially, as the likelihood of this retrenchment goes up, meaning there's a larger probability that you may have to repay back China this H and lean back on the market alone, meaning that you may have to use the market potentially to do this adjustment in baskets of the world. Guess what? You want less of China, you want less China exposure. So in a way, our model, to be clear, our model sits at P equals 0 and H that's pretty low. Now, it could be that we're not measuring the H right in the data. It could also be that the countries may be thinking that the PSS is much higher than what we are observing. But the key point here is that countries countries don't always want to go all in on China. And more importantly for us, we also think that this can lead to sort of small changes in PSS or perceived sudden stop risk vis-a-vis China can imply large adjustment in your optimal or desired allocation of Chinese debt. And so Cesar is not here, but I promise him that I will be the Argentine today because we cannot do sovereign debt without talking Argentina. I'm joking. But Cesar has this thought, which is if you could use this test to speculate about Argentina. Long period of close political proximity to China, Peronist government, rising exposure. We see that in the data. Sudden swing to right-wing politics. Maybe Argentina is more exposed to a higher risk of having to pay down these non-trivial Chinese loans. And because in this setting, we're thinking of that as a change in the probability of a sudden stop. PSS. But more broadly, emerging countries can be vulnerable to this. Okay, I'm almost there. So we model Chinese debt as subsidized, non-defaultable, rollover-prone debt. We think it's a unique form of geopolitical rollover power. We think it has a disciplining effect such that around inflows, the countries choose to delever from the bond market, enjoy lower spread in anticipation of the repayment they have to face. We think this can be informative of thinking about alternative ways of thinking of geopolitical counterfactuals in the international financial market. China can be strategic and deliberate in targeting countries in terms of their access to bond market. And also countries can face boom-bust cycles in terms of the exposure to China. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for asking me to present this to discuss this very interesting paper, which addresses one of the most interesting developments in international finance of the past 30 years, which is the rise of China. And particularly focuses on the interaction of China with other creditors. So focus on credit heterogeneity, which I think is very welcome. It fills a gap. The literature on China has largely been empirical thus far. This is one of the first theoretical contributions, and I think a very interesting one to think through this Belt and Road lending. And it's also part, I see this paper as part of a studying broader phenomenon, which is official finance. So when governments lend, when states become international financiers. And in an attempt to situate the paper in the bigger picture, let me show one graph on from our own work with Carmen and Sebastian that just we released as a working paper where we decompose the external debt of countries. This is all developing countries and emerging markets in the sample, 130 plus. Into what they owe to private external creditors and what they owe to private official creditors. So, IMF and World Bank well known, but there are all these regional financial institutions, all these institutions you've never heard of, and of course, lots of bilateral government-to-government loans, right? So this paper really studies basically a big chunk of official of the external debt composition of developing countries. Many here, including myself, so far have focused on the private side of external finance. But given the size of this in the total external debt stock, the size of official finance, I think it's very worthwhile to also push theory towards studying this phenomenon, and particularly think about the interactions between all these different types of lending. The rise of China and the long history of official debt has been particularly spectacular. Within just 20 years, China has become the big elephant in the room, the biggest official lender, in particular via these state banks, whose portfolio has surpassed the portfolio of the World Bank as of the late 2010s. Problem with China is, of course, always data, so this required a lot of puzzling together. And we could compile these debt stocks towards China, and you really see how impressive the rise of China as an official, as a big international creditor has been. So it's definitely a phenomenon worth studying further. So China's rise has not just been fast and large, but it's also been, and this is something the paper very much focusing, has special features, right? So what the paper calls Chinese style debt. So what is this? What are these special characteristics that the paper ultimately rests on, right? And there are two main assumptions that really make this paper, interesting and generate all the key findings. And these two assumptions are, first, that the debt is non-defaultable, which of course for a sovereign debt researcher is a bit of a blasphemy. The second is that it's a sudden, there's this special sudden rollover risk, right? So that countries face special elevated risk that they need to repay this debt at any point in time, right? So on top of the usual rollover risk that countries face. So these, and my take is that these, assumptions are strong, that they're stylized representation of what we find in the data, what we found out, but I think that they overall make sense. And indeed, this is why I think this is a very useful benchmark framework to thinking about Chinese lending. First assumption that really is key. Is China's debt really non-defaultable? Well, not in a narrow sense. There have been, many arrears. There have been many restructurings of Chinese debt, more than 100 restructurings of Chinese debt in the past 20 years. Many of them are hidden as well. So again, puzzling together all these. But as I will show you, these restructurings have low haircuts, right? So they are in a way, and they are lower than comparative restructurings with other creditors. So there's a lot of seniority if you want. Second, there are these innovative collateral schemes or innovative contractual schemes. So one of the fascinating things about China is that they have really tried to push the legal machinery, overcome the classic enforcement problems that this literature, of course, has been thinking about for a long time. And they've been very innovative. One of the ways they've innovated is these collateral schemes. And they're not just cheap talk. We observe in a paper that we've written that there's actual cash basically collateralizing Chinese loans. And these loans, this cash collateral sits in Chinese banks, right? And that makes the debt to some degree non-defaultable or less defaultable, because if you default on a Chinese loan, then you can grab the underlying collateral cash in the Chinese bank account. Okay, let me just very briefly, this is just a signal, just how it took us a long time to understand. This is work with a legal scholar, how these contracts are actually set up. It's quite intriguing. It's a mesh of contract finance, like classic firm finance, corporate finance with sovereign lending. So very fascinating new setups. The key point is, imagine you are Angola, you borrow for an infrastructure loan, and then China sets up this collateral scheme where the Angolan oil company deposits a share of its revenues in a Chinese bank account. So these are completely unrelated revenue streams that back the infrastructure loan. And these cash flows streams, the collateral underlying the infrastructure loan, then sits in a Chinese bank account. So if Angola were to default on the infrastructure loan, in principle, the bank can seize the cash collateral sitting in China that comes from an actual very secure source of revenue, mostly the commodity exporting big state firms that provide that revenue streams, right? So you can think, well, this is actually not a scheme that makes Chinese debt senior, that makes it to some degree non-defaultable. Second, haircuts, as I said, are low. This is from an ongoing project. These are the Cruz-Estrebisch haircuts. Sorry, I don't know what happened here. These are the Cruz-Estrebisch haircuts, and this is from an ongoing project on the size of haircuts for Chinese restructurings. You can see that they're very low on average, and if you use bond yields or market discount rates, you actually get a haircut of close to zero. So effectively, you can think of these restructurings as another form of rollover. They don't provide debt relief. So in that sense, again, we don't really have defaults in a classic sense. So in that sense, assumption one, I think, can be in a stylized way found in the data. Second, where does this sudden rollover risk come from? I think here the paper just very briefly mentions this, but I think this needs a bit more space in the paper because it's just very fascinating what the Chinese are actually doing here. So in many of these contracts, there are these strong acceleration clauses, meaning that pretty much at the discretion of the Chinese state bank, a bank can be called in default. A loan can be called in default. Right. So let me read you out the language from a GDB, China Development Bank contract with Ecuador. This China Development Bank can call a default, right? And if event of default occurs if any public entity of the Republic of Ecuador takes any action which would disadvantage a PRC entity. So essentially, if Ecuador issues a new labor law, and this is disadvantage to some Chinese FDI project in Ecuador, in principle, CDB can just call this a default, which means that you have to immediately repay the full loan. This is acceleration effect. You have to repay the full loan immediately, giving the borrower, giving the lender, giving China a lot of discretion, giving a lot of what they call creditor power, right? The special rollover risk. So again, very sympathetic to the second key assumption, which is like, this is, if you borrow from China, you face an additional risk. You never know whether they're gonna ask you to not only whether they're going to roll over the debt, but whether you have to repay it at any point in time. Much of this debt is also short maturities. And just to illustrate that rollover risk in China is very real, this is the sudden stop that we've observed, right? So this is the net flows to developing countries. This is the boom, and this is the bust, right? So at this, since 2020, we see that developing countries are paying more in interest and principal to China than China is giving new loans, right? So arrivederci indeed. This is a classic sudden stop. So this rollover risk is both there in the contract on top, and it's there in the actual rollovers. Okay, so once we take these two key assumptions, right, that make what they call Chinese style debt, what do we learn, right? What's the key insights? And to me, that was, very illuminating because they point to two key mechanisms. One, of course, the classic carrot, right? These are subsidized loans. So there's a welfare effect, and we've seen that very nicely in the presentation. The second is this disciplining effect that the paper really emphasizes. This idea that because that this is high risk debt and you might need to repay it without the option for rollover, right? You actually borrow less from the market, there's this dilution effect, and this is beneficial also for your yield. So you discipline your borrowing towards other creditors, in this case, bondholders. Okay, and then they show that in the data, this disciplining effect that is at the center of the theory is also consistent. The empirical results are consistent with this idea. What I find particularly interesting were these counterfactuals in the second part, which really, it's the first time I've seen a theory paper that helped me to rationalize how the BRI, how China's Belt and Road Initiative really worked in terms of lending. So that I really liked. The model helps to rationalize why impatient borrowers, right, and those in a low income state are most prone, most attracted by these high risk subsidized loans. And it also rationalizes why we see these boom bust patterns, from borrowing countries. And very nicely, this example of Argentina, Cristina Fernandez might have expected this lending relationship to remain stable. Perceived rollover risk was low, so they borrowed heavily. Argentina borrowed heavily from China. Now you have this government turnover, and suddenly rollover risk goes through the roof, and meaning that this explains, part of these boom bust patterns from a country perspective. And I think this is very valuable. Like that is something that I really find intriguing about the paper in the overall contribution. What are my suggestions for improvements? Well, one is on the theory side, the paper emphasizes multiple times terms like credit power, geopolitical rollover risk, without making that an explicit part of the model. I think here the model would benefit from incorporating geopolitics, in particular strategic behavior by the side of China, more upfront, right? So basically, much of this strategic behavior from the Chinese side is assumed away because China's lending is exogenous, right? This is taken as given. And here, I would be interested to learn, can you think about modeling debt traps, right? So where China lures in borrowers and then threatens to not repay them and uses that for geopolitical advantage? Or can you think of governments can obviously influence the probability of rollover, right? That's not in your model at the moment, but you could integrate that. So if I, reject Taiwan, well, I can maybe increase my rollover risk. So use geopolitical alignment as a policy tool that countries have to their disposal. I think that would be very interesting. And also, what's the optimal geopolitical lending strategy? You mentioned this in your slides, but I think you can really expand on it, right? So can this model that gives a clear sense of the rationale of governments, when to borrow, under which states of nature, etc., from China, can that help to shed light on how China decided to lend and where? And that can be beautifully tested in the data, right? Because you can see where China went first, with which volumes, how the geopolitical alignment was at that point in time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you can do much more there. On the empirical side, the disciplining effect that you show is interesting, but of course correlational. And there, the key concern is, of course, this is mechanistic. Yeah, you borrow from China. Well, you don't need more funds, and therefore that's why you see bond borrowing go down. So basically, mechanistic cash effect. Well, some ideas for identification. One, I would like to see some more narrative or qualitative evidence that this disciplining effect is at work. Second, I think you could use maybe more proof for local projections with inverse probability weighting to tackle the most obvious confounders. But then maybe more ambitiously exploit government turnover as an IV for the government's perceived rollover risks and lending access to China. Maybe exploit shocks in China. There are papers that have done that. You can maybe use that IV on the political economy side of China, or on the monetary policy side of China, to predict outflows to EMEs and use that for identification. And then the model predicts that seniority is key. Well, there's a lot of heterogeneity in this lending. If you go to the 8 data set, you can actually exploit what loans came from Exim, which are more defaultable than, say, CDB, which have more stringent clauses. So can you use intensive margin in toughness in these loans to test your model directly, because you would predict that the disciplining effect is stronger if the country has received a lot of these tough loans, the more contractually strict loans, than the more concessional loans from Exim. Overall, this is a very nice paper, and to me, it was a very interesting benchmark to think through the Belt and Road in a new way. So I look forward to the new version. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's open to questions. Linda, you want to start?
So this is a super interesting paper and a great discussion. So I just had one reaction, and maybe this is beyond both the paper and neither Christoph nor the author talked about it, but so there's kind of this idea that if you switch the loan portfolio towards sort of loan where you now have a big stick and you impose that they must pay back even in bad times, which is really costly, so they're not going to want to do it, so borrow less. And this is a disciplining effect, and this is good. But actually, the country's borrowing for a reason. And nobody talked about, well, where are these investment loans going to? And I know this is the way this literature models things, but you might think there are some interesting things around whether the collateralized loans are actually targeting these loans to specific projects. And you might think that it's even more costly than you've modeled. If, for example, you get in the middle of a big infrastructure project, and then you stop building the freeway or the bridge right in the middle of the project. And so you've really got them in a tough spot. So anyway, if there could be a little more conversation around, there must be some marginal product to these loans or payoff to these loans that's not missing from the whole discussion.
And
pointed out a phrase, interaction between multilateral, bilateral, and private. In terms of non-defaultability, part of it maybe comes from the escrow stuff, that Christoph put forward. I thought a lot of it came from the interaction with official lending. I perceive there would be a willingness to hold up flows from the fund, flows from elsewhere, if there were to be a sufficient of China. So, I guess figuring out how to include that in the model, understand how the matter, maybe the sort of discipline effect comes from the fact that the non-default triggers for the multilateral flows that maybe obviates the move to borrow more private.
Sure.
So great paper and great discussion. I would like to go back to what Linda said, and then what Christoph said, nail it down by identification, because this whole idea of you use cash as a collateral, and that's why it's non-defaultable. I mean, this is a standard thing for big borrowers. You look at the SME in the United States borrowing from Bank of America, they do the same thing. The big difference here is this escrow account, right? So because it doesn't sit in escrow account of Bank of America, but it is pledged all the time. And if Bank of default, Bank of America can take the cash and the account receivable, which is the main form of the SMEs borrow, because they are big borrowers. So here, that's the big thing, because obviously the other country, right, you have to do this escrow account. But I feel like it really has to go back to demand and the big borrower. So if there's a big borrower and demand for credit really underline this thing, and then that's otherwise the way the contract is very standard how small firms borrow big borrowers.
Thanks.
It's a really nice paper. The paper left me with one question, which actually echoes something that Linda said, which is more Chinese borrowing good or bad for a country? And the paper goes through some pros and cons. No borrowing from China means lower spreads, that's good, but more rollovers, that's bad, and some other pros and cons. But the bigger issue is where's the money go? If you borrow more from China, is more of the capital inflows into investment, which could be good, but is it a productive investment, or is it Chinese projects which may not be productive for the country? So I was wondering if you could just push a little bit more for countries that switch to rely more on China's lending. What is the impact on productivity, on growth, on investment, consumption, et cetera, like that? That would be really useful compliment to know if this is good or bad, or another bad.
Thanks. You want to take some minutes? Respond.
Awesome. First of all, thank you, Christoph, for a very nice discussion. You are so knee-deep in the details of the data and the contract. That was actually enlightening. So thank you. I think I take all your suggestions, Christoph, right on board. I think we can certainly do more, as both on the empirical side in terms of, at least I think of it as heterogeneity in the effect we're getting. And I think that goes back a little to Shebnem's point as well. We can exploit a little bit of that, whether it's seniority, whether it's, we can do more on the heterogeneity of that effect and see it out. I think we can do more on the China strategy broadly and think of maybe the growth of that Chinese lending where it's grown. I had to think a little bit about the debt trap stuff. I think the endogenous component, I mean, your Ecuador contract example is a good one. You can take actions as a country that can basically make the pie higher or lower. So I think there are some useful extensions there. But overall, I like the way you approach it as well, which is we want this to be a benchmark way of thinking about the problem, and I'm glad you see it that way as well. No, Linda, you're absolutely right. I think we have an endowment in common Y is moving around. It could be that those H's come with a level shift, but not right away in the future. But if it gets stopped in the middle for whatever reason, it's bad. So you can see the up and the down. For now, I think, as I said in the talk, it's as if I'm pushing that under the rug of the net present value effect. But we can try to be a little more systematic about it. I think it goes back to the question about whether it's good or bad. The data is pointing to the fact that on average, the countries receiving those loans are more corrupt. So I think suggesting that the usefulness of those loans is tricky. The data is pointing to a lot of countries. Part of the reason why the ratio of Chinese debt to market debt is really high is because it tends to also be to countries that are not issuing a lot of capital on bond market. So if we think that accessing international capital bond market is also a signal that you're taking a good project, then maybe China is going to places where the project they're making are not as good. I don't want to speculate too much on that, but those are some of the things we think. I think another way to think about the carrot and stick, Linda, is that the default cost here just depends on your income exogenous component, Y component. It doesn't depend on anything else. And I think those are also places where we can try to sort of go more into sort of the details of the useful net productivity of the China debt. I think, Brent, you're absolutely right. I think in the data we saw that the debt, it's funny, aid flows were more counter-cyclical. Non-Chinese aid flows were very counter-cyclical. Bad times, you get to get a lot of help. Chinese flows are not so much in a conditional way. But one thought I had when you discuss from your thought is that it could also it matters whether or not we're being in trouble with China makes your other lenders, your other official lenders, more patient, more So I think those interactions could be interesting. It kind of goes back a little bit into heterogeneity discussion about the effect. And Shebnem, I think. Yeah, in some ways it looks normal. In some ways it looks different. We try to go one corner solution to clarify the thinking, but we can try to fall in the middle a little bit. All right.
More questions? Yes.
We get some similar sort of promotion scene, right? I didn't understand our part of that. And in that case, also, whether to observe the distribution, like, I imagine that give like some loan that we need a loan and become responsible, right? See that it doesn't have any risk on the income, no? Is that is that we have to say more, right?
Yeah. I think, Federica, I think you're pointing to one thing. I think I mentioned sort of this net present value effect, but technically the fluctuations from China are also making your overall income process more volatile, which is in there, which may mean that you may want to, you want a smooth consumption, so that matters. Another way to think about it is that this is based, China introductions are keen to sort of a modify augmented income process, not where sort of the state of the world is no longer a scalar Y, but a two-dimensional scalar, like Y normal and a Y China, and they interact. I think what we like and the way we think about it as, and there are many models that you can think of in the sovereign default literature, like a regime switching model where there's exogenous, endogenous political cycles. And I think the name of the game here maybe is that the same way we have talked about For instance, Cesar has some work. We look at left-leaning versus right-leaning governments. We can think about, high sudden stop rate, low sudden stop risk. This one way is that this allows us to project a little more concretely in the data on these inflow-outflow state and their counterfactuals. But I'm very sympathetic to sort of this augmented income process and the income risk view of sort of the way we are modeling China.
Across the board, all of these documents, private and official. It was a shock to the country. They can't pay everybody. Plus, all causes come in, and everything's accelerated to today, where the country can't possibly make that big a payment because their entire stock of external debt, both official and private, becomes the rule on that day.
Yeah.
What follows then is a negotiation of the creditors, both official and private. And just as a matter of fact, not theory, I can't imagine that China would be considered a senior negotiator in that sense, unless they're willing to send a navy. So, it strikes me, instead of assuming something is non-defaultable, and something is defaultable. Seems to me you got to think about that negotiation.
Yeah.
That negotiation starts the day when they can't pay everybody. And it can't be collateralized. The whole collateral of the country is less than the external debt, the private external debt. And I think you really got to face. If I take it as a fact, it's true. In China's different.
Yep.
You don't want to just look at Paris Club negotiations and things like that, but I think you do need to look at negotiation. And what it's like on the day when you get together in a room, all these creditors have a claim on the country that's due that day.
Yeah.
That they can't possibly pay. And they're not going to pay China in that situation because they simply cannot.
So, yeah.
A lot of the discussion was, what does non-default mean? I think it would be helpful to approach it in that negotiation, which has got to happen.
2-3 points. It's a comment well taken, and I think it echoes a little bit Brent's point about the interaction with the other lenders as well, which in a way we are not in the data and in the model we are not taking more seriously, but we could do more. Technically in the model also it's a point well taken. I think there's discussions China wants not to join those multilateral negotiations explicitly in some of those contracts, but in the model we can do more, and I think that's something we can explore. Thank you. So 2 questions here. Okay, I'll do the control. Gita, and then in the back.
So firstly, I wanted to just say it's really great that you're working on this particular on China in the debt market and in the sovereign debt and structural literature, because that's absolutely the very critical part. If you want to think of debt restructuring right now, the low-income countries are the ones that have to default. There's a big China play, and it's very different from the kinds of models that exist. Right. So I think that's really great. And this is obviously a start, so you're going to be thinking more about this. But again, I think maybe in future paper or next iteration, it would help to look into the exact mechanics and institutional arrangements and everything, because there's obviously market debt, which we've all modeled 1,000 times. Bonds and so on that are traded on markets and was familiar with. But then there's a whole official lending and multilateral lending. And what you're describing here is what would be called, it's a combination of lending from Exim is official lending, CDP, lending from CDP is called market lending. And then there was the Paris Club, and then there were the multilateral institutions. And there is a pretty important bargaining game that happens in terms of how the debt gets structured. What is correct is that I would say that if you were a private investor in a country and the country is borrowing from China, that restructuring, is now a lot more messier than it used to be. Mm-hmm. Before, Paris Club and the multilateral institutions would be like, they would quickly be fine. it is messier. Now, there is the G20 common framework that was created to kind of get China to understand how these things work and also to kind of go with the program. And so there have been improvements, right? So I think when this structure is important, if you want to really speak to this question of what is China's lending and world economy doing to debt and its access to market debt, so on, it would help to know to do more of that.
Oh, thank you. I hear the theme. Thank you. In the back, and maybe that should be the last one because you're on time. Yes.
In there, the description of how the British in a sense took over Egypt, okay? And it's very close to what you're saying, it's very close to like Julie is saying. So the question is, what's the real difference between China and the gunboats? That's really the bottom line. Gunboats.
I think on that note, I'll give it back to you.
All right, thank you very much to everyone. Let's continue 9:45.
Oh, perfect. Do you have a
slide?
Do you have a USB?
No, I don't have this.
Something for the next round. So.
Oh, great. Oh, perfect. Thanks.
The one person. Did you hear activation is like?
No, this is awesome. I have to get one of. Why did Mac do something? I really, every time. Always, they want you to pay $50 for something every time.
Thank you.
I'm discussing not the next one, but the last one. Hi. Have you already uploaded your slides? Oh, okay. Here you go. Do you USB or anything? Or there's adapters on the bottom. Sure. Yes, I got it. This must be, yeah, discussion dollar last one. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't know. I didn't expect from it. I'm saying this. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be something like that. Yeah. That's me. I was like, oh, yeah, okay, that's. Well, you guys haven't asked one thing.
Yeah, no, right.
And then we just. And we'll stop with this.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's.
So, hey, sorry. How are you? Hey, nice to see you. You want this? Just saying.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Straightforward. Market. Yeah. All right, we're very happy to have Chris talking about the great game. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much to the organizers for putting us on the program. It's a pleasure to be here. Hegemonic countries like the US and China use their economic strength from their trade and financial relationships to pursue geopolitical and economic goals. And we're moving into what looks more and more like a bipolar world where we have two hegemonic countries, the US and China, that both compete with each other in the geoeconomic sphere, but also maintain valuable trade and financial relationships with one another. And so today I want to think about kind of at a big picture how optimal policy for a country like the US should change when it's faced with a geoeconomic competitor. For example, if the US is thinking about imposing export controls on sales of chips to China, how does it matter that China is actually a geoeconomic competitor with the US and not just another country, potentially large country in the world? When the US is thinking about its containment or accommodation policy, what should it pursue? Should it try and promote China, sell more chips to it, and focus on earning economic rents from doing so? Or should it try and contain China, restrict sales of chips, and try and prevent China's ability to compete within the geoeconomic sphere? Moreover, we see a lot of talk from countries like India suggesting that there's benefits to great power competition because it gives two parties that you can play off against each other. We want to think about, is geoeconomic competition good or bad for the welfare of countries in the rest of the world? And so I'm going to lay out a model today to try and think some about these questions. Within this model, there's going to be two interdependent hegemons that are selling upstream goods to each other that then get used in downstream production. So by way of example, think of this as the US and China are selling chips upstream, and that's used to produce AI models downstream. Then these AI models are sold to countries in the rest of the world, and each hegemon uses them to pursue economic coercion. It threatens other countries' governments with suspension of access to their AI models if those countries don't comply with demands for changes in their economic or other behavior. Now, what's going to be specific about this problem is because there's two hegemons competing for these threatened governments. The outside option in their relationship with the US is the offer they're receiving from China. That's what's going to give rise to geoeconomic competition. These hegemons are outside options for each other. The key mechanism I'm going to show you in this paper is going to revolve around each hegemon trading off the profits they get from their continued trade relationships vis-a-vis each other. The US makes money on its chip sales to China against the extent to which their sales fuel the ability of their competitor to compete within the geoeconomic sphere. US sells chips to China that lets China develop more advanced AI models that then lets it compete. Because again, the US's threat here is to suspend access to its models for a country if it doesn't comply. If China's models are better, that country then has a better outside option that helps it withstand the US's pressure. I'll show in this world that symmetric containment, where each hegemon uses its optimal policy to contain the other, is more likely to arise when the two hegemons are closer substitutes. For example, when their models are similar to each other and easy to shift between. On the other hand, asymmetric containment can arise when one hegemon is technologically dominant relative to the other. If the US is much more advanced than China, then the US is going to pursue containment and focus on power, while China pursues accommodation and focuses on economic benefits. And we think at a high level of this as informing us as to the evolution of US-China relationships, moving from a world in the 90s that looked more like accommodation when the US and China were more differentiated into a world that looks more like bilateral containment today as they've become more similar. Also show that the welfare benefits for the rest of the world are multifaceted. On the one hand, there is going to be a benefit that comes from these two hegemons competing with offsetting demands. If the US says move left and China says move right, these demands partially at least offset each other, and each hegemon squanders some of its power. On the other hand, the point of the containment policies is to make the other hegemon's AI model worse. If the US is making the Chinese model worse and China is making the US model worse, then all these options are worse for countries in the rest of the world to use, and global economic efficiency falls, lowering global. So to just briefly connect to the literature, we're building on a literature or an intellectual history in IPE. And in particular, we're contributing to the fast-growing letter on geoeconomics. We're building on our own first paper on the hegemon's offensive paper and our second paper on defensive policy. And we're here by bringing in two hegemons. And in that, we're contributing to some other really great papers studying the two hegemon problem, including people in this room like Christoph, John, our discussant, and Tim had a really great job paper this year on two hegemons. So let me dive in. So just to give the graphical illustration of the model, we've got two hegemonic countries, the US and China, just by way of labeling, that are each have an endowment of an upstream good, think chips, that they can use in both their own downstream production and in the downstream production of the rival hegemon. These downstream goods, think AI models, are sold to the countries in the rest of the world. And here we'll differentiate between two types of countries. We'll have non-aligned countries that are able to make productive use of both of the hegemon's goods. And these will be kind of the targets of competition between the two hegemons. And then we'll have aligned countries that for cultural or geographic reasons are more closely economically tied with one of the two hegemons. And we'll represent that by saying they can only make productive use of one of the two hegemon's goods. So to give structure to the model, I'm going to make a set of assumptions that's going to let us get down to nice linear solutions that we can actually get out in closed form. So to do that, I'm going to start our hegemons countries with representative consumers with linear preferences, where that linear preference is just creating the opportunity cost of employing that upstream good in production. Consumers consume out of their wealth, the endowment of the upstream good, and sectoral profits downstream. So the preferences of the government of each hegemonic country are going to combine together the consumption utility of their consumer with a vector with preferences over a vector of aggregate quantities that I'm going to use later in the talk to capture direct geopolitical objectives. But for large parts of the talk, I'm actually going to shut this off. The downstream producer of each country is going to produce with a Leontief production function that's going to give rise to a simple linear cost function. And this linear cost function is going to give us some nice tractability. It's going to make our lives easier by making price indices linear and enabling us to get clean closed form solutions. So this linear cost embeds both the direct unit cost of combining the two upstream goods in production, scaled proportional to their costs, with an external economy of scale. As each hegemon sector produces more, that sector becomes more productive and its costs lower. Here we're capturing the two ways that the price of the sector can be influenced, one through its costs of inputs, one through as it scales up, it becomes more productive and its costs lower. And both of these are going to be at play in our model. The rest of the world, we're going to embed with simple linear quadratic production for their final goods producer. This linear quadratic production is going to have two key parameters that we're going to emphasize. One is the productivity the country gets from using each hegemon's good, theta. The second is the substitutability of the two goods on the cross product term. That substitutability is capturing how easy it is to shift between the two hegemons' goods. That is how common the costs are from using both in production. The consumer in each of these countries, again, has simple linear preferences where they're consuming out of their. As I mentioned before, we've got two types of rest of world countries, the non-aligned ones who make positive productive use out of both goods, and the aligned ones that can only use the good of their respective aligned country. Lastly, markets for all goods, both upstream and downstream, have to clear within this static framework. Now let me walk you through the timeline. Up to now, I've just shown you the economic block. Now I'm going to bring in the geoeconomic block. And I'm going to introduce this through a staggered timing assumption that's going to let us capture the strategic dynamics of this model. Let me work backward through the timeline, which is intuitively how we'll solve them. So in the end, after governments move, producers produce, consumers consume, markets clear. Fold back to the middle. This is the hegemonic offensive problem that we've studied in our previous work. What we've got here is each of the two hegemons is going to go to each government that it has an economic relationship with in the rest of the world and demand a set of costly actions for either transfer payments or changes in their economic activities, which, as in our prior work, will represent through insertion of revenue neutral wedges in their decision problems. And each hegemonic country will threaten suspension of access to the goods, to the downstream good it controls, if that country does not comply with its demands for costly actions. Now, we've got to embed a strategic interaction between these two hegemons to make this problem interesting. We thought a lot about how to embed this. There's a lot of options like contractable contracts that end up being a kind of very difficult solution concept. What we ended up going with that provides a really nice trick that we've also used in our previous work is to embed a staggered timing of policies to capture the strategic interaction. So in the middle, we're going to embed a Nash and Nash bargaining, where each hegemon takes as given both the terms of the other hegemon's contract and that it will be accepted by other countries. So there's a minimal strategic interaction at this stage. Instead, we're capturing the strategic influence through the policies set in the beginning. In the beginning, each hegemonic government can set export wedges on sales of its upstream good to the rival and its downstream good to the rest of the world countries. And at this stage, designing this policy, each hegemon is thinking about, if I control sales of my upstream good to my rival, how is that going to influence how my rival wields its power in the middle? That's going to be the heart of the geoeconomic competition problem here that we're going to emphasize. Okay, just quickly to kind of finish up the model, then I'll go into results. So the heart of this model is going to be the participation constraint of the non-aligned country. Given the Nash-Nash bargaining protocol, when the non-aligned country is thinking about whether or not to accept the US's offer, it's thinking about, do I accept both the US and China's offers and comply with both of their demands for costly actions, wedges and transfers, and retain access to all goods, or do I reject the US's offer and accept China's offer? In which case, I don't have the US's good anymore. I have the Chinese good, and I have to comply with China's demands. And just for a notational note here, we're always going to use the indexation minus H or not H to refer to the other hegemon when we're talking about hegemon H. What are these two value functions? They're the two profit max problems of those countries when they've retained access to all goods and have to respect both hegemons' demands, or when they've lost access to one hegemon's goods and have to only comply with the others. The aligned, of course, are similar, but their outside option is 0 because they only have a relationship with one hegemon. Okay, lastly, hegemons maps in both stages. They're maximizing their utility plus transfers. In the middle, they're doing it through the contracting coercion problem in the Nash and Nash game. And in the beginning, they're doing it through the choice of their bilateral export wedge policies, internalizing the effect that it's going to have on the contracting game in the middle. Okay, so let me start telling you about the results. So first set of questions, containment or accommodation. How do these hegemons pursue restrictions or promotions of each? In this model I've set up, there's two mechanisms by which a hegemon can try to shrink their rivals' downstream industry. They can use the ex-ante export wedge, charge a higher price, restrict access to their upstream good. That's going to directly make their rivals' production more expensive and inflate its price index. They can also use the ex-post wedge, demand that the non-aligned country buy less from their rival using their power. That's going to reduce their rivals' downstream production. That's going to reduce their efficiency via the external economy of scale. And so the first component of optimal policy here is the optimal demanded wedge set in the beginning, which is going to combine these two economic and geoeconomic forces. On the one hand, there's a force to promote purchases by your rival, because if your rival sells more to the rest of the world, you sell more to them through your upstream good. That's going to let you earn more economic profits, and that's going to be a good thing for your country. On the other hand, there's the power consideration. The power consideration revolves around how you're affecting the inside and outside options of the non-aligned country through the price of your competitor. And let me dive into the next slide on this force. So, as in our previous work, let's define micropower as the maximal private cost and value of costly actions that each hegemon can demand of the non-aligned country before its contract is rejected. This is closely connected to the notion of relational power. In our nice linear quadratic setup, this power has a closed form solution that's just related to the relative productivities net of prices of the two options and the substitutability of the two options. Intuitively, if one hegemon has a much more profitable good, then it's going to have much more power. If the two hegemons' goods are very close substitutes, then each is going to have much less power. What's important, though, is that power here isn't exogenous. It's endogenous to the equilibrium prices of each of the two hegemons' goods. And this is where you get rise to macro power, the strategic incentive to manipulate the attractiveness of your rival. How do you do that here? Well, if you downsize their sector, that's going to downsize their external economy of scale, that's going to inflate their price, and that's going to make their good more expensive and less attractive. So if the non-aligned country would try to scale up use of the Chinese good when it lost access to the US good, then making that good more expensive makes the non-aligned country have a worse outside option. They wanted to scale up, but because the Chinese good is less attractive, they can't do so as profitably. This is the source of the hegemonic power building in this type of geoeconomic problem. It's about manipulating that gap between the inside and outside options by manipulating the price. And in this model, it comes down to a combination of the ex ante and ex post policies that you have in play in order to manipulate the attractiveness of your rivals. So how does this total containment or total accommodation policy vary? Let's look first at what happens in the substitutability. Intuitively, if these two hegemons' goods are highly substitutable, then the US's threat against the country is blunted by an attractive alternative. If they're perfect substitutes, then the US would have no power because the non-aligned country would say, fine, I'll just go scale up the Chinese good if you come. And so thinking back to the power formula, this is going to give the US a lot of incentive to make the Chinese good unattractive, to make the outside option worse when the non-aligned country rejects the US's demands. That's going to lead us into a world of actually bilateral containment. As the two hegemons both become closer substitutes with each other, they both have an incentive to start containing each other. On the other hand, if we think about low degrees of substitutability, like the separable case, if it's separable in production and you lose access to the US good, there's no value to scaling up with the Chinese good because your production is perfectly separable. That's going to give us a world of bilateral accommodation where each hegemon focuses on earning economic profits from the other because they're not competitors in the space of power. Other key determinant. What about the productivities of these two options? Well, I told you earlier, as one option becomes more attractive relative to the other, you start getting an increase in that hegemon's power, and correspondingly a decrease in the other hegemon's power. What this is going to lead to is when there's an asymmetry, the more attractive hegemon starts to pursue containment, while the less attractive hegemon starts to pursue accommodation. What's happening here is a manifestation of what we've called the nonlinearity of power in our prior work. Remember, power here is quadratic. As you get more and more concentrated towards one hegemon, their marginal increases in power start to go up as their good gets relatively more and more attractive. What's that mean? That means the more dominant hegemon has a really strong incentive to make their good just invaluable to the boundary country. They pursue containment and start foregoing economic profits. The less powerful country then has less ability to capitalize on power, and so shifts to focusing on economic rents instead. And so you get this asymmetric containment accommodation policy. So that's the kind of total policy aggregating across the two. Now let me separate it down into what changes with the ex-ante component of the policy because of geoeconomic competition. How does the US set its export control or export wedge on semiconductors, knowing that China is actually a geoeconomic competitor and not just another country? So in this model, optimal policy is kind of intuitively going to revolve around two classic forces. We're going to have terms of trade manipulation operating here because if I restrict the supply of my upstream good, that's going to increase demand or the willingness to pay for that upstream good. And that's going to let me capitalize on my terms of trade and earn economic benefits. Then there's also going to be the power building incentive, which I've just alluded to. I'm going to be looking to control the gap between the inside and outside options by making my good indispensable to these countries. Where geoeconomic competition is going to come in is I know that as I change my export wedge, I'm also changing how my competitor is going to wield its power in the middle. So let me show you how those new incentives come into play in optimal policy by going through the first order condition. I'm going to go through the FOC because I find it very instructive to illustrate forces. I just want to mention again, we present the actual closed form solutions within the paper. So as we go through the first order condition for optimal policy here, let's consider each of the forces determining each hegemon's optimal choice of export wedge. First, there's the classic terms of trade component, which here is just going to give rise to the classic terms of trade formula, or would give rise to the classic terms of trade formula, where you'll set the export wedge equal to the inverse of the foreign import demand semi-elasticity. Here it's coming as you sell more of the good, you increase your rents on each unit of sale, but you also decrease equilibrium sales by making your good less attractive. Then the second component, which comes even without a geoeconomic competitor, is the geoeconomic power building motive, which we've characterized in our econometric. And this is that force for manipulating the gap between the inside and outside options. Even if the alternative good is sold by just another country as not a geoeconomic competitor, you still want to make it less attractive so that the outside options of these non-aligned countries become worse. Worth mentioning, of course, that's in cases of substitutes. If the non-aligned country would scale up use at the inside option relative to the outside option, power building will go in the opposite direction. The new forces come from geoeconomic competition. As you know that your competitor is going to be coming in with demands for costly actions, you know that you can use your optimal policy to influence how your competitor is going to wield its power and get them to reinforce your own goals for building your own power. So how do you do that? Well, the first force is your rival may be trying to contain you. If your rival is containing you, that's undermining your own power. And so what you want to do is you want to push your rival's policy towards accommodation of you. If they accommodate you, then you become even more powerful because it's reinforcing usage of your good and scaling up your own external economies. Second way you can do it, if you're trying to build power by containing your rival, well, then you want to push your rival to facilitate your containment policy. How do you do that? You decrease your rival's attempts to promote their own good. That's going to reinforce your containment and make you even more powerful by making their good even less attractive to countries in the rest of the world. So in the last about 3 minutes I have, let me shift from optimal policy to thinking about the welfare implications for the rest of the world. And what I'll show you here is that there's kind of two facets of the welfare implications for these non-aligned countries. On the one hand, there's going to be benefits that arise from offsetting demands. One, the US is using its power in part to contain the Chinese good.
while at the same time, China is using some of its power to promote its own good to the rest of the world. These are offsetting demands. The US is saying do more or do less. China is saying do more. These cancel out, at least in part, and each hegemon squanders some of its power. That's going to benefit the non-aligned country because it's going to effectively reduce how much they have to end up giving. On the other hand, each of these hegemons, when they're trying to contain each other, is doing so for the purpose of making the rival's downstream good less attractive. That's with the goal of inflating those equilibrium prices. When both are pursuing containment, both hegemons' goods prices rise. That makes the non-aligned countries' outside option worse vis-a-vis both of the two hegemons and ends up making it worse. Generically, the welfare is going to combine these two effects, and then it's a question of which of the two dominates. Let me show an illustration of this, bringing back that geopolitical externality term that I introduced early on. I'll do it with a simple example. Let's incorporate a simple geopolitical rivalry where each hegemon experiences a negative utility externality from the wealth and transfers received by the other hegemon. Think of this as something like you care about your own relative resources relative to your rivals. We'll interpret delta here as an increase in that geopolitical rivalry. So what happens as delta goes up? Well, as delta goes up, you want to start restricting your competitors' ability to collect transfers from the rest of the world. So you want to undermine their power. How do you do that? You start containing them. So containment starts to go up as the geopolitical rivalry escalates. As a result of that, while the purpose of bilateral containment is to inflate prices, both of equilibrium prices go up, and you end up with non-aligned countries facing more expensive goods that give them worse outside options. How can you see this manifested? You can do out the welfare decomposition into the non-aligned country, here for the perturbation to delta, into the effects through power. There's both the power through each of the two hegemons. If the US is pursuing containment, then the non-aligned country benefits as China promotes its own good. I'm getting called on time myself. That was clearly a mistake. On the other hand, so I will wrap up. On the other hand, as both countries pursue containment, prices go up. That makes their outside options worse and makes it harder for each of them to constrain and to withstand the other hegemon's demands. So since I've called time on myself, let me finish. We've shown a model of geoeconomic competition between two competing hegemons that's highlighted the trade-off between economic profits from trade and power competition, and shown how containment is shaped by the substitutability and technology difference, as well as characterized how rest of world welfare consequences can be multifaceted, both benefits from competing demands and harm from worsening global efficiency. So thank you, and John, I'm really looking forward to your comments.
Much, Chris. Right, we're happy to have John now.
All right. Thanks so much for having me to discuss this super interesting paper. So for those of you who are not as steeped in the geoeconomics literature, let me sort of give you a little 2x2 of how I see this fitting into the optimal policy part of the literature. So there's one part of this literature that's sort of building on work purely about sanctions that studies a single hegemon and tries to understand if it already has a certain amount of power that it's built up through technology or in its trading relationships with everybody else, how does it wield the power that it has? So it has no ex-ante investments to build that power. The hegemon just exerts. So, it may exert it in terms of trade or in terms of finance or to one end or another, but that's sort of the first part of the literature. There's another set of really interesting papers that studies when a hegemon knows that later on it's going to be exerting power, what ex-ante investments or policy commitments can it make to strengthen its hand when it wields that power? And again, these papers are different in terms of how the power is wielded later on, or what are the ex-ante commitments that you're capable of making. Okay, so a more recent strand in this literature has considered the case, largely motivated by US and China competition, where there's two different hegemons, and they're each trying to wield power either over one another or over small countries that they both like to influence, but they do so in one another's presence. And again, these papers are different in sort of the nature of the competition that these large countries have. And then where this paper is coming into play is sort of in the bottom right here, where there's just a few not very well-known contributions. And this paper is really making a very significant one about the case where there's two hegemons. They anticipate that they're going to be competing with one another in the future, and they're thinking about what can I do today, using export control, say, to weaken my hegemon, weaken the other hegemon, so that I have the upper hand when I'm trying to sway small countries in the future. Okay, so let me give a super quick overview of the structure of the model because I thought it was super interesting and kind of new for many of us. So there's 5 different types of countries in the model. There's 2 different hegemons, the US and China. And then there's a bunch of small countries. Some of them are aligned just with the US. They can only transact with the US. Some are aligned just with China. They can only transact with China. And then some are not aligned, meaning that they can transact with both countries. In terms of goods in the economy, there's an upstream input. So that was what the authors were using chips as an example for, that the US and China produce and they sell to one another. Then there's a downstream input. That's like AI services that the US and China also produce. And then the US and China sell those AI services to all these small countries around the world. And super important for their model is that in the AI services layer, both the US and China have external economies of scale. So the more that US is selling AI to India, the better the AI it can sell to France. Okay, so the paper is all about policy. And there's 2 different times at which policies are determined. The first is that ex-ante stage when countries are preparing to exert power on small countries. And the second is when they're actually doing that exertion. So what happens at the ex-ante stage is that both the US and China can decide on export taxes that they want to apply to their chips that are being used by one another's AI sectors. And then once they've committed to those policies, they offer these sort of contracts building on Chris, Matteo, and Jesse's earlier work to each of the small countries. So what is a contract? Well, if a non-aligned country here accepts a contract, it's committing both to what wedges it's going to face on AI that it purchases from the US or China. So it might face a tax on buying AI from China and a subsidy on buying AI from the US. And it also commits to a transfer, which is basically the US extracting some amount of wealth from it. Okay, so the US sends these contracts to non-aligned countries and aligned countries. China sends these contracts also to non-aligned countries and to Chinese aligned countries. And something that's important here and easy to miss is that this is a model where a non-aligned country, say Costa Rica, can accept a contract both from the US and from China. So it's not that they sort of have to pick and choose, they can just make a deal with both parties. All right, so after both types of policies have been set, so export controls ex ante and these hegemonic contracts in the interim stage, then production, consumption, and trade take place. All right, so that's the world we're living in. And the authors used this interesting model to produce a number of insights. And I think Chris did a really great job of describing these. So I'm just going to sort of move forward to my comments. Okay, so I think what the authors are really successful at in this paper is finding a way of setting everything up so that it's tractable and they get closed form solutions. So this is super nice because it's a really complicated model, and not knowing all their tricks, I was a little bit surprised they were able to do this. That said, there's a bit of a catch, which is that the solutions are really complicated. So for example, here's sort of the main proposition characterizing the US's export controls. And what are the US's export controls depend on some scalars rho. And what are the scalars rho? Well, they're defined in terms of primitives, but you have to go to the proof. And here actually rho depends on primitives as well as beta and gamma are defined in a different part of the appendix. And so, this is what it is, right? It's a complicated model. It has a complicated solution, but it's hard because if we want to do those comparative statics like Chris was emphasizing and know, how does substitutability between US and Chinese AI affect what are my ex-ante policies? There's like 10 different effects in different terms here that you have to work through. And so it's really hard to know analytically, well, I shouldn't say analytic. It's really hard to know intuitively, what are all these different forces? And so, of course, what do the authors do? It's what we all do in this situation is they go to the computer, but they don't discuss the calibration. And so it's a little hard to know which of the terms are really going to be important in practice. And it's hard to know whether the forces that show up in the graphs are the ones that they're describing in words, or at least it was for me. So the way that I think about this is sort of, whenever we all write models, we're on a continuum between the simple analytical ones, the rich, carefully calibrated ones. The simple analytic ones are good for developing sharp insights. The carefully calibrated ones are useful for credible quantitative conclusions. And the authors are definitely going for here the sharp insight side of this, and I think they're largely succeeding. But there's sort of an uncanny valley between the two of these things where neither do we get sharp insights, nor are we, calibrating to the real world. And I think the authors might be flirting a little bit with the uncanny valley. And so I want to push them to, move to the extent possible towards the sharp insight side of things. So the constructive part of my discussion is going to be a suggestion for how they can move a little bit in the sharp insights direction. So what I spent last week doing is trying to come up with different variants of their model and see which of them are tractable and so on. And so one variant that I thought was useful, we do lose something, but I think it helps us unpack the mechanisms, is the case where we get rid of those aligned countries that can only interact with one hegemon or the other. So now you're going to have a bunch of countries in the world other than the US and China, and both US and China can offer contracts to any of them. So let me walk through a little bit of my understanding of how the model works in sort of that limit. Okay, so just like the authors, I'm going to sort of backward induct, and I'm going to say, first, let's try to understand, given the export controls that the US or China imposed ex ante, how do they compete by offering those contracts to small countries? So, and in particular, what are the wedges that they impose as part of those contracts? So that was, those contracts say that when I'm Costa Rica and I sign onto one of those contracts with the hegemon, I have to impose a tax on my purchases of AI services from China and maybe a subsidy to my AI services with the US. So there's three different reasons that a hegemon, say the US hegemon, is going to impose a wedge in its contract with Costa Rica. The first two reasons are kind of familiar and economic. So first, this is a model with external economies of scale. And so, Costa Rica doesn't internalize that when it buys more AI from the US or China, it makes those sectors more productive, but the hegemon wants it to. Interestingly, the US hegemon actually wants Costa Rica to internalize the externalities that occur both in the US and China, because even those Chinese externalities get passed on through lower costs to all the other small countries around the world that the US has contracts with, and the US effectively can extract the surplus that is created by fixing externalities inside China. Okay, but so that's mechanism number one. Mechanism number two, Chris sort of already discussed, it's that to the extent the US has chip export controls on the chips it's sending to China, it wants to encourage Costa Rica to buy AI from China because that generates more demand for US chips and has a fiscal externality onto the US. And then the third one is this geoeconomic force that the authors are, it's been sort of at the forefront of their work, which is that to the extent the US taxes Costa Rican purchases of Chinese inputs, because of this external economies of scale, it makes Chinese productivity in the AI sector lower, and that worsens the outside options for Vietnam and India and all the other countries that the US is contracting with and allows the US to extract more surplus. Okay, so far we've been talking about these ex post wedges that the US wants to design given its ex ante export taxes. Now that we understand these wedges, what we can do is plug them in and say, still at the second stage, given my export taxes, how does what Costa Rica actually buys in quantities depend on both fundamentals and the export taxes we set in the first period? Okay, so what I have here on the right-hand side is a formula for this quantity is how much AI Costa Rica is going to buy from China. And on the right-hand side, I'm saying, well, this depends on a bunch of primitives as well as the export controls that the US and China have used ex ante. And something I found really interesting and surprised me when I worked out this formula is that the constants are all positive here. So actually, the higher are the export taxes that the US applies to chips it's sending to China ex ante, the greater are going to be China's downstream sales in equilibrium. So why is that? Because obviously in partial equilibrium, if the US taxes chips more, Chinese AI is going to be more expensive and people are going to buy less of it. So the reason is the higher are US export taxes on chips to China, the worse of an outside option is China for, India and Vietnam and so on. And that means that when countries defect on the US contract, were they to do so, they wouldn't end up buying that much of Chinese AI. And therefore, the US isn't that worried about the quality of Chinese AI. And so in its contracts with all the little countries, it doesn't have to ex post discourage them that much from buying Chinese AI because China's just not that much of a threat. So this is a sort of really interesting and counterintuitive mechanism, I thought. Conversely, by a sort of similar logic, how much AI Costa Rica buys from China is going to be decreasing in China's export control on US chips. Okay, so finally, now that we've discussed sort of ex post in the second contracting stage, what are optimal policies and how do they affect behavior, we can step back like the authors do to try to understand what does this mean for how the US should be designing export controls on Chinese chips. Okay, so I'm going to do this in 2 steps. First, let's consider a super simpler baseline where you don't even have those external economies of scale. In this case, there's just one force, which is that the US wants to prohibitively tax any chips that it exports to China because that makes the outside option really crummy, for Costa Rica when it's thinking about not accepting the US's offer. Now, the one reason you might think you wouldn't do this in the model is that on path, now Costa Rica has to buy these incredibly expensive chips from China, and that's distortionary. But remember, on path, the US also offers Costa Rica subsidies, and so it can just ex ante tax the input that it's sending to China, but ex post subsidize Costa Rica to buy Chinese chips, Chinese AI, and exactly undo the inefficiency. Okay, and then finally, I want to introduce external economies of scale. This is where the force that's the most novel to the paper shows up. So that's that the US's ex ante policies, its export controls, can affect the contracts that China offers when it's exerting control on other countries around the world later on. So this is sort of the most novel part of the paper, and so I want to emphasize what are the mechanisms that operate here in the special case I'm studying. The key mechanism is that the higher are the US export taxes ex ante, the more output China is going to sell downstream later on. So that was the mechanism we discussed in the previous set of bullets. But the higher is China's output in the second period, because China cares about getting its firms to internalize externalities, the more it's going to provide subsidies for small countries to buy Chinese AI. And then those subsidies are something that the US hegemon is able to extract from small countries. So basically, small countries are getting a bigger subsidy now because China's subsidizing its AI products due to externalities. The US can say, oh, you're getting a subsidy now, I'm going to take that for myself. So there's one effect like that where higher US export taxes mean more Chinese output, which means more subsidies the US can capture. It also means less US output, which leads to smaller subsidies from China, so less for the US to capture. Those two things are competing with one another, and they compete with the geopolitical mechanism that operates even without external economies of scale. Okay, so I said I was going to simplify the model and try to tell you all the mechanisms. That was, of course, still pretty complicated, but what I want to encourage the authors to do is to, experiment with what are the different limits they can take. Are there other ones that may highlight different forces? And hopefully that can give us a deeper understanding of what I think is a super rich model. It's the first treatment I've seen of containment policies. It's almost the first treatment I've seen of ex ante policies shaping geopolitical competition. So yeah, I think there's high returns to considering different simpler variants of the model, moving forward, and hopefully they can build their intuition a little bit more. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Let's open the questions. Tarek. Super cool as usual. So I'm stuck in a rabbit hole. So I guess what determines whether we want to contain each other is the elasticity of substitution between the E's and D's. And you said US and China are becoming more similar to each other, so presumably that elasticity went up. Now, I feel like a key question for this is, should I be applying this model for good by good, or should I be applying it for the whole economy? And in the former case, it's sort of obvious to me that the elasticity of substitution in some areas has gone up. In the latter, it's far less clear to me. And I feel like the tension comes from the power. I feel like I can apply across domains, so I should be able to use it across goods. So can you help me with that?
Great topic discussion. I have a hypothesis, and I think your model is about. I'm curious about your thoughts. So if we look at the US Soviet Union, those two countries were tremendously generous to their allies. They have, for example, US had transferred resources to Western Europe, to Japan and South Korea, and the Soviet Union has transferred resources to China, Eastern Europe, South American countries, and so on. But now if we look at the US-China case, they are stingy. They don't throw fists with their friends. In fact, US has talked about charging their allies for the public good it has provided. So what explains this difference? Does your model parameter can help us think about this? So for example, maybe you can argue that China has been more kind of focused on commercial interests, while Soviet Union is more about ideology. So is there anything change on the US side as well? Interesting questions for the politicians. So.
No, really intriguing and deep structure here. I thought, can you actually kind of transform this to think about hegemons in terms of corporations as being players and corporate tax policy, what capital you attract in terms of specific factors? I think maybe it's just an application of the theory, but this is just fascinating.
Very interesting paper. So one thing that caught my attention is like the hegemon can provide one key input to the to the rivals downstream sector. But in reality, one thing that happens is that there might be a set of vertically differentiated inputs that the hegemon can provide. And so what we see often in real life is that the hegemon restricts the top vertically differentiated input. So basically provides a crappier version of them. Although we actually even see corporations do that. For example, auto corporations, very often they license old models to emerging countries. And so have you thought about expanding your model in that direction?
Okay, let's give some time to the others, Chris.
Thanks as always for the great comments. Just some of the comments address tariff, I think it's a very good question. Here we really think it has to be down to thinking about the differentiation of goods that are used for the purpose of power production. There's a lot of goods out there in the world that, are not great candidates for power production. Like if a good is very substitutable in production and there's a lot of alternative suppliers, then it's not a very natural candidate for power production. And it's not something that we necessarily, care about when we're thinking about what is the differentiation between China and the US. What I think from a power perspective we want to really think about is not necessarily good by good or economy wide. It's what are the goods that the US is using for its power projection, and what are the goods that China is using for its power projection. And so it's about how kind of substitutable those goods are with alternatives in the rest of the world. To Shengyang's question on kind of the evolving, the evolution of kind of how the US uses its power. It is one of the really interesting facets of this evolution is we did have a kind of wild, like under the Marshall Plan, especially where we use a lot of foreign aid inducements in order to reconstruct Europe, as well as and deliberately to try and bring them under our sphere of influence. Now we move to a world that does look a little bit more belligerent. We're relying less on kind of positive inducements to induce policy changes and using a lot more economic facts. One of the kind of speculations we have building on our prior work is that some of this may be from changing values of commitment as we move into a world that looks like more like a bipolar world. If you think about like what disciplines a country like the US to adhere to the rules of the game, a lot of it is the ability to know, as I contain my use of power today, I'm going to preserve the willingness, especially in my allies, to maintain themselves under my economic sphere. And then they'll keep playing with me. I'll earn dynamic rents off of their continued alliance, and we'll keep going with that. As an alternative emerge, well, they're going to start eroding some of those rents. China's becoming a more attractive option, potentially for a lot of countries. If the dynamic rents available to the US start to go down, it's the willingness to maintain that discipline may also start to grow. It's something we're definitely thinking about as one of the possible directions we could go with either this or another paper. To the question of hegemons as kind of applying these ideas in the corporate context, I actually think that's a very interesting kind of direction that these papers can be taken. There is a lot of parallel here. If you have a very large corporation that is able to both lobby regulators for policy changes, as well as internalize the macro implications of what it's doing, even with just the direct money, you'll get kind of some of that power production. I want to influence regulatory policy so that it benefits my corporation more. If I'm a really big player, I can also internalize the macro implications of that, which I think we think of as one of the big kind of fundamental things about a hegemon is it's not just thinking about the direct relationship, it's also thinking about the equilibrium consequences of each of its relationships. Then I think you can also get large enough corporations thinking about both the direct influence on the regulator as well as the macro impact. So that it's an application that I think has not been well explored yet within the literature, and is a great direction to going with that. And then Bruno, your question on kind of where you're targeting with this within the chain. I think that comes back to some of the question of like where the ultimate good you're trying to influence is. The way I would think about this is you're looking to target those kind of end goods within your geoeconomic rival that are then used for their own power protection. And so if your kind of connection to their supply chain is high up in their supply chain, then you might be targeting it with your input kind of at that most upstream change. If your connection is much more downstream, you may be targeting. And if you don't have a connection directly within that supply chain, you may be focused more on the ex post policies of using your actual power to contain the Chinese good rather than targeting it. Also, if you have a very undifferentiated good ever into their supply chain, that's another reason. If it's very undifferentiated, they've got a bunch of alternative suppliers. They're just going to substitute away as soon as you try to impose the export control. And then you're not going to use that ex ante policy to try and shape their power, you're gonna have to focus on your demands for costly actions to try.
Perhaps one more question? Yes.
I see that one first order effect that you guys have modeled is the fact that raise price, you have less quantity. And that for sure is really important. I just wonder if there's also an effect coming from moving away from the optimum. That is to say, we start from the equilibrium optimum, right? Now that we're having less quantity, that actually has a cost relative to where we want to be.
Totally agree. I mean, right now it's happening, we're essentially like, so what's happening here is actually that does start to manifest through how you're thinking about your relationship with the boundary country, or I'm sorry, the non-aligned country. We change the terminology, so occasionally I'll slip. The non-aligned country, as you're thinking about targeting your policy, ultimately what you get out of your relationship with a non-aligned country does scale proportional to their inside option. So as they become more profitable, you are able to extract more surplus. So that actually already gives a kind of an effect of distorting their away from their private optimum, which is coming through as I contain the rival, they move away from their private optimum. That lowers the end profits I can extract. What's counteracting that here is the fact that, well, that I have more of an influence potentially on their outside option than on their inside option when they're trying to scale up that balance. But for example, if I thought about the world of complementary goods downstream rather than substitutes, what would I think about? If the goods are like beyond TF in the boundary or the non-aligned country's production, then as I try to contain China, I'm actually going to be crashing the inside option relative to the outside option. That's going to distort their production away from the efficient point and then lowering how much the US is.
So I just wanted to connect this back to something that was said yesterday. We were talking about taxes on the capital flow. And Gita made the point, messing with the US bond market would be devastating for the global economy. So, you're kind of playing with dynamite and it shouldn't, shouldn't say it shouldn't, but that's a consideration. It's interesting to me that we're sort of talking about tinkering with these various taxes at different stages, but it's not really, is it really dynamite? I guess that's my question. Like, is it because trade is somehow more, I don't know what it is, but can you tinker around with these things and it's not going to be totally disruptive to global markets? Because maybe there's a limit to really how much, yes, there's power dimensions here, but relative to playing with the bond market, maybe this is small peanuts. I don't know if that's true or not, but I am just that thought.
No, and I think a lot of that is coming out in how these countries are thinking about the trade, within our framework, the trade-off between economic profits and power considerations. I think this is, somewhere where it's kind of useful to lay out the theory and kind of understand these different forces at play. The kind of parameterization is such that overwhelmingly, these goods are kind of not very, not easy to substitute in power, but they've got high elasticities within downstream production. Then you're going to be in a world where it's really hard to do anything to your rival. And as a result, you're not going to focus on power considerations. You're just going to try and preserve those economic profits. And that's where I think it comes down to what the properties of these industries that are being used within power production is. Happy to let
experts on AI models comment on what the properties are. I would actually be myself very interested to know whether they have that same kind of essential role that they think that dollar does.
All right, thank you very much to everyone. Let's continue. 10 minutes break, please. Let's continue at 11 sharp. Right. So to close our session today, we have Kan Soylu presenting. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for putting our paper on the program. This work is joint with Shebnam and Mohammed at the Global Linkages Lab at Brown. Last year, the United States instituted the largest tariff hike since Smoot-Hawley. The expected exchange rate appreciation, the expected exchange rate reaction associated with this is appreciation. And the logic is relatively simple. Tariffs shift relative demand away from foreign goods towards home goods as they distort relative prices. If you have a model with endogenous production in it, that effect is strengthened by the fact that if you have foreign inputs that you tax, your good will also become relatively more scarce. Both of those things via the goods market channel is going to want to push the terms of trade and the exchange rate to make home goods more valuable. So you should see appreciation. I think a lot of you know what the next box is going to say. On tariff days itself, the United States dollar actually depreciated both against the euro and the broad dollar index. If you look at the total delta between the beginning of the Trump administration, the second one, and today, there's loosely been 12 percentage points of depreciation in the US dollar against the euro, and about half of that has occurred on what we call tariff event days, even though half of the sample is not those days. So more of that depreciation occurred on tariff event days, especially when we see tariff hikes. We ask a really simple question, which is why? Why did the US dollar depreciate in response to tariff announcements, especially those hiking tariffs? And to preview the answer, I want to look at these two boxes from a different lens. On the goods market side, the terms of trade wants appreciation. But the exchange rate is an asset price that equilibrates both exchange rate markets, both financial markets, asset markets, and goods markets. So we need something from the asset market side to overpower the appreciationary pressure from the goods market side. The question is, which exact asset market shock might do the job? We are not the only ones to seek an answer by any measure to this question. This is a long literature with amazing papers written by the folks in this very room. Let me highlight our contribution, tying it back to the Big Tariff Network paper we wrote and presented last year. So in a class of macro impact of tariffs models, you usually get depreciation from retaliation. In that network paper, we showed that retaliation and also expected retaliation and certain network structures can get you depreciation and terms of trade worsening via the goods market channel itself. But in real life, there was no retaliation. We don't think some, quirky aspect of networks causes depreciation by itself. And in fact, that paper was a pre-Liberation Day paper, and even then it was clear to us that there was something going on in asset markets. So the first thing we did in the first version, before Liberation Day, was putting in a UIP shock. And since then, and that was to capture the asset market shock, since then, 3 large classes of explanations have been proposed to pin down exactly what that asset market shock might be. The first is the idea that the safe asset demand for the dollar might be declining, so you get a lower convenience yield. It might even flip the other way. The second one is the fact that the US has a very large gross position, so the valuation effects are a lot larger than in models where you only have the net position, and that creates a depreciationary pressure. And the third is the idea that when I go from 1% tariff volatility to 10% tariff volatility to 20% tariff volatility, that uncertainty itself could be weighing on the exchange rate. We wrote an AEA small piece about this, and this paper builds on that idea. So what we do in this paper is we try to take those 3 asset market shock concepts, put them in a single model, and then take it to data. Let me tell you what we do. On the theory side, we built a 2-country model with unbalanced trade and that's an important ingredient. Segmented markets, because we do need to break complete markets in this context. And like that little AA piece that this is based on, we allow the variance of tariffs itself. And I'm doing the Trumpy hand gesture on purpose. Every time I say tariff volatility, I'd like you to think about the range of tariffs widening and narrowing. 10% on Colombia at 2 a.m. in the midnight, or 8 a.m. official White House statement. The range is moving. So we have that moving range enter directly the UIP condition and the Euler equation. The first via intermediaries risk perception, and the latter via precautionary savings. On the data side, we build a database called Tirade, because there have been a lot of excited statements. This is a time-stamped database of every announcement you can imagine. Again, 3 a.m. I don't like Colombia. All of it is in there. From the beginning of the second Trump administration to May of this year, obviously amazing work has been done on documenting these tariffs. By itself, that is not a big deal. But what we capture is that 71% of the announcements that we find are not in the statutory record. So if you're looking at things that actually entered the books, that is going to be a small subset. And we want to capture, I think you know where this is going, every time you get a tariff announcement, what happens at high frequency. So that's the empiric side. We do this both with intraday windows and daily. Some of our data work is ongoing. So today I'll mostly focus on our day-on-day results, but I have some other results if you're interested. With that, we show 4 main results. The first one, and this is something we show analytically, this is not a quantitative result, in the empirically relevant case, where the US is a net importer and has a net negative position, the gross position by itself cannot generate depreciation. It can dampen the appreciationary force from that goods market terms of trade channel, but by construction, because it's a reactionary force, it needs something to fight. Because it's fighting appreciation, if there was no appreciation, it couldn't fight it. It couldn't generate depreciation by itself. It's an endogenous transmission mechanism. And we show this analytically with our model solved. Second, the convenience yield as measured by the Treasury basis does not seem to be moving much in event windows. Now, we do not believe this by itself in any way says anything about the broader safe asset demand literature. It's quite possible, in ways that might be related to tariffs even, that overall uncertainty about the US could be weighing on the rest of the world's dollar demand. But it does seem to be the case that repricing does not happen around tariff announcements. So that's a finding that we have, and that's not a very difficult one. It's just changes in that Treasury basis around event windows. In fact, other folks have found this to say, oh, maybe tariffs didn't matter for safe asset demand, and it's quite possible. But as a corollary, the Treasury basis seems to not matter that much in these announcement windows. So what seems to matter? We construct a basic composite index combining VIX, uncertainty based on stocks, and implied volatility based on the exchange rate. Those 2 measures only. That measure, a 1 standard deviation increase in it around those event windows tends to depreciate the dollar by 0.24 percentage points, and equities decline by 0.67%. The interest rate differential remains flat. This is precisely the sign and the magnitude that we find in our theory work, as I'll show in a few minutes. So it appears that we have uncertainty playing a big role. What can we do with the model next? As a final exercise, we ask ourselves the following question. What range of parameters would be consistent with the regression estimates that we find? So it's a basic Bayesian estimation. And the main interesting finding there is that you really need markets to believe that tariffs are not persistent, because you need something to really dampen that goods market channel. And it turns out, if I really believe they're going to decay fast or that they'll never take place, that's a good way to do it. And for those of us interested in this class of models, even with financial shocks that are disciplined by the size of the UIP premium, as I'll show, you really need this last ingredient because it's hard to kill the terms of trade channel. So now with that, I'll start with the model. What we do is pretty standard. So I'd like to highlight things that differ from a standard symmetric two-country model. We have two countries, endowment economies. You should think of home as the United States. We have home bias. The first parameter I'd like to highlight is A, which is we have asymmetry in home bias. So gamma F, which is the rest of the world's share of American goods in their baskets, we just write that as some multiple of America's foreign dependence. That by itself is not interesting, but it gives us analytical tractability. So A is a parameter that tracks asymmetry in our model. What it does, though, is it allows us to have, that asymmetry allows us to have unbalanced trade. Because if, suppose the two countries are equal in size for a moment, if America's share of foreign goods is 15% and the other countries is 10%, that by nature at the steady state encodes the US as a net importer. The second thing I'd like to highlight is that home households have Kara utility. So every time, remember the hand gesture, as the range of tariffs widen or narrow, this will impact the Euler equation as an additional wedge. And if risk specifically given by tariff uncertainty widens, this could act as a precautionary saving shock. 3, we encode the gross position in the following way. The US borrows in dollars, so BH is liabilities, and saves in foreign currency. We fix the stock of foreign, so the stock of euro assets that the US has. Alternatively, we could have disciplined just the wedge, but we choose to fix the quantity. It helps with our tractability. Next, we have segmented FX markets with risk-averse mean variance intermediaries. This came up yesterday. It's a very standard way to set up this problem. I'd like to note 2 aspects of it. The first is the fact that, oh, I can use this, great. So the fact that we have a convenience yield liquidity service flow term. So we just bake that in and we want to track that in the model. And the second thing is, again, as it came up yesterday, the intermediary's balance sheet won't equal the cross-border position by construction. These folks are doing the arbitraging at the margin. The next ingredient is the process that we assume for tariffs. So tariffs follow an AR1 process. That's not super interesting, but the innovations follow the following process. So today I am informed about the range of possible incomes about tomorrow's tariffs, tomorrow's tariff innovations. As that thing widens, that timing convention allows us to simplify a bunch of terms. And when we solve the model, we actually end up with a system that is linear. So we originally do a second order approximation. With a set of assumptions, we end up with a system that is actually linear in 3 shock variables. The first one is tariffs. Second one is their volatility. And the third one is the convenience yield. So quite literally, we want to be tracking our different culprits in the model and in the data. Those features show up in 3 key equilibrium conditions that I'd like to highlight. The first is the Euler equation. You might notice that inflation is missing. That's because in both countries, the price level is fixed. It's a flex price model under monetary neutrality. It doesn't matter. But what's notable is that the precautionary saving term, which is that volatility of tariffs directly enter the Euler equation as a wedge. That eta, in the interest of time, I won't get into it, but it's a solved out coefficient. It depends on the consumption's dependence on tariffs, because this comes from the variance of consumption term in the Euler equation. The second equation I'd like to highlight is what the intermediary problem yields. It yields a UIP equation with a wedge. That wedge has 2 components. One is what would be the forward risk premium. That's what we'll map that to in the data. This is how overall volatility feeds into the UIP condition. And then you have a convenience yield, which we're going to capture with the CIP wedge. And then on the external account side, because this is linearized around an asymmetric steady state, there's 3 features I'll highlight. Number one, that A term shows up here. So as the rest of the world has less dependence on you, you can mute the impact of the rest of the world on the home country's balance of payments. We have the interest rate term here because it's a term we normally simplify away when we linearize around a symmetric steady state. It shows back up. And finally, we have the gross position. In principle, valuation effects, depending on which side of the balance of payments you look at, home country versus foreign, it could look larger or smaller. We think this is a good primitive to think about. V tilde is the ratio of steady state euro assets divided by USD liabilities of the US. So as it becomes closer to 1, for a country with a net negative international position, it means that the balance sheet is a lot wider for a given net position. The net position is closely going to be tied to what we encode with asymmetry and the steady state net exports. But in principle, we allow the gross position to be wide or small, and the model allows us to actually check what V tilde does to the rest of the variables. So we solve the model using the method of undetermined coefficients. In doing so, a key object for us is the risk-sharing wedge. This is the deviation from the Bucke-Smith perfect risk-sharing condition, defined as hat W, exchange rate minus relative consumption. Under complete markets, the assumption is in the beginning of time we make a contract. If I ever institute tariffs on you, I promise I am going to transfer some of those tariffs back to you in the form of Arrow-Debreu transfers in the states of the world where I place those tariffs. That kills a lot of the interesting stuff that we want to capture. So in our context, because we don't have a complete set of assets, the Bucke-Smith perfect risk-sharing condition won't be met. Instead, this W is going to both encode a jump component from the forward-looking variable as well as those asset market shocks that we just talked about. A key interpretation here is that when this wedge increases, that is a wealth transfer to the rest of the world from the US. It tends to, in partial equilibrium, just looking at that equation, it tends to push E up and the relative consumption down. Now, when we solve the model, we can write the exchange rate as a function of the contemporaneous level of tariffs and this asset market Bucke-Smith wedge. The first term is negative. Oh, don't know how that happened. Excellent. The first term is negative. This is that goods market channel that I was talking about. So it wants to push the exchange rate down. Exchange rate going down is appreciation in this model. And then it's summed by W times a positive coefficient. So in principle, if W is positive, that is, wealth is going to the rest of the world, in principle, you could actually get depreciation from tariffs. That W is an endogenous object for us. So when we solve these coefficients, that W is a linear function of the state variables. This will give you the intuition that you already know, which is that as the convenience yield goes down, psi goes up, that widens the UIP premium. It tends to push W up. It tends to be a wealth transfer to the rest of the world, pushing depreciation. There is a similar effect from the UIP premium component of sigma squared, but additionally, sigma squared has the precautionary saving term. That also is depreciationary because I am the biggest user of American goods if I'm America. And if I'm reducing my aggregate demand, that tends to tilt relative demand against American goods. What's interesting is that gamma tau is unambiguously signed if the gross position is 0. All those terms of trade gains as they enter the balance of payments are a wealth transfer to the United States as long as we're not in the Bucke-Smith perfect risk sharing world. What's interesting is once you do introduce the gross position, this gamma tau can turn positive, and then this W can turn positive. So the question we're after is, can this be sufficiently positive to make this whole thing positive, causing depreciation? Can the gross position itself, in this specific context, cause depreciation? The answer that we find is that it can't. And it's actually an analytical boundary result. The first component says this is just the way we calibrate the B's. So V is always going to be positive as long as the US saves in the foreign currency and has liabilities in the dollar. And to make that steady state sustainable, we assume exorbitant privilege. Under those conditions, with the empirically relevant case of a negative trade balance, a unilateral tariff is always appreciationary. You have to leave that boundary to get depreciation. Specifically, you have to flip the sign on NFA to do that. It's a bit of a strange thing to say, oh, by this boundary result, we found this. The intuition actually is a lot more straightforward. This is an endogenous transmission mechanism. The valuation effects are taking in that appreciationary pressure. And as the dollar becomes more valuable, America's assets become more valuable and its liabilities become less valuable. If the initial impulse was not appreciationary, you could never get that counter effect. So we're looking at a counter effect in this range of parameters. So suppose W indeed was large enough because of that term, a quick proof by contradiction verbally, then that would make the valuation effects actually transfer wealth back to the United States and cancel out the thing that caused the depreciation in the first place. So we just show that analytically. So with that, we can now do a full sign table and get the testable predictions of this model to go to data. So tariff level causes appreciation on the exchange rate, pushes equities down because we use the Kara utility households SDF, and it tends to push the interest rate differential up because in our world, tariffs are transitory. So if this is, even if it's 0.9999999, because this is a relatively expensive period to consume in, it tends to push the interest rate up. The convenience yield causes depreciation, pushes the stocks down, and increases the interest rate differential. And then uncertainty is similar to the second shock in the first two components. But because the Euler effect precautionary saving is pushing demand and the interest rate down, that is fighting the UIP premium wanting to bump up the interest rate differential. So on net, with the third shock, you would expect to see a smaller number here than what you would see with a pure convenience yield shock. All right. What does that all mean? We believe tariff announcements don't just encode one information about the tariff level. We believe it actually potentially contains 3 shocks, and we'd like to track them using the timestamp. Number one, when you get an announcement, you learn if the tariff level for a given good, given country, or the aggregate went up. 2, from that, you can see that the potential range of tariff outcomes can widen or become narrower. And 3, in principle, if we believe that that itself might change safe asset demand, that convenience yield component can move. So to test this, we develop the tirade database that I previewed. This is every communicated tariff rate, speech, social media, official communications. We try to throw in everything, and we don't try to filter anything out. So if you wanted to say, oh, I want to clear some of the noise and look at a subset, you could do that. But we show our results with the widest data set available, and some of them are going to be significant at 10% and not 5% because potentially the smallest announcements get lost in the noise a little bit. But we're okay with that. So blue is threatened rates. Green are implemented. You'll notice usually blue is higher than green. Won't surprise you. 434 rate statements. Again, like I said, 71% of it is outside the statutory record, so you need a database like this to capture what those announcements do. And when they're too close to each other to construct reliable windows, we actually cluster some of them together. So Liberation Day in our raw data set is, 10% on this and 12% on this and 13%, but you want to bring them together. So it's hard to measure uncertainty. Everyone in this room knows. What we do is we combine 2 well-established measures, which is VIX and implied volatility of the Euro USD. They both are capturing the idea that when I look at an options contract for a risk-neutral investor, there is an implied variance there for the underlying variable. So we do simple PCA analysis and do a first component and pull out the first component. You could ask, okay, how useful is this? This seems like a generic market measure. if you look at in the entirety of the second Trump administration, the days in which this measure moved the most, 17 out of 25 are tariff announcement days. And I'll try to show you a bit more with an IV regression how we actually think that around announcement windows, the movement in this variable really captures the changing range of tariffs. We measure the convenience yield with the Treasury basis. By using survey data, we can construct the UIP premium because we have people's exchange rate expectations. We do that with consensus surveys and ECB's professional forecasters survey. They both give pretty much the same result. In the first quarter, and in our convention, we start the first quarter on January 20 to capture that first period until April 20. In that first quarter, the UIP premium was 3%, which is huge by US standards. I have to check that number 7 times, and then I had to check it with the ECB survey. And in both databases, you do see a large number. Using the Treasury basis, you can ask yourself, how much of that was that covered portion? Granted, that might not be all of the convenience yield, but how much of it was the Treasury basis? And it's about 0.5%. If you do this a little more generously, if you look at the change from that fourth quarter in 2024, you get about 10% of the contribution to the growth in the UIP premium coming from CIP. So as a pure data moment, CIP seems to be a small component of the UIP as measured by surveys. And on announcement windows, it does not seem to be moving that much. We don't dispute the secular erosion hypothesis, like I said. We find the same number if we look at, beginning of 2025 and middle of 2025, the same as Jin Young and co-authors, about 0.3 to 0.2% increase in that Treasury basis, but it does not seem to be happening around the event windows. So here's sort of a whole paper in a figure attempt. In the top left panel, on the vertical axis, you have Euro USD depreciation. So again, up is depreciation. On the horizontal axis, you have this composite uncertainty measure. In gray, you have non-event days. There's a fitted line there also in gray, but it's so flat you can't see it. And then there is an upward sloping red line that is the fit for event days for the entries in red. So on event days, this uncertainty measure is correlated with depreciation, but on average, it doesn't seem to be. So on average, you can have a safe haven effect or other uncertainty shocks and whatnot. They tend to wash out, but on event days, there is the strong relationship. We don't see something similar with the CIP wedge measured by the Treasury basis. And this holds if we look at the broad dollar index, excluding the euro, of course. So our model solution, and this is a bit too cute, we admit, is linear in those 3 variables. So in a small event window, we can say that the shock variables moved because of the announcement. And as they moved, the regression coefficients recover our desired structural coefficients that map to the model. We're trying to take a parsimonious model as far as we can, as far as you'll let us know with the questions. So in the first row, you see that the change in the tariff level isn't really statistically significantly associated with change in the dollar, change in stocks, or the interest differential. So you get a tariff announcement, and on average, it doesn't seem to be doing much. You look at the CIP wedge, you see bigger numbers, hypothetically, really persistent CIP shocks. If we had more data, might be consistent with that coefficient, but on average, there's a really wide confidence interval. CIP wedge is also not having a significant effect on any of this. And then we look at our uncertainty measure, and it basically finds that it pushes the exchange rate up and stocks down. If we do a Shapley decomposition, about 84% of variation that is explained comes from that uncertainty measure. A question that I imagine a lot of you are thinking is, you're looking at VIX. How do I know that this thing has anything to do with underlying tariff variance? We do an IV regression. We try both the TPU, which is a well-established trade policy uncertainty index. We also look at the actual variance of tariffs in our model as it informs future variance. Both of those IV regressions are significant, and the first stage gives you a meaningful coefficients in line with that regression. Finally, we take the model to data, we go back to the model, simulate it to do a Bayesian estimation. We just adjust the shock timing. So we shock tomorrow's tariffs today just to make the experiment more realistic. And we find that this rho really has to be very low to kill that goods market channel. So with that, I'll conclude. Dollar's depreciation around tariffs seem to be priced tariff uncertainty. You might say some of it is risk sensitivity. We believe we clear that with IV regressions, but it's not perfect. And I would love to discuss better ways to hack at it. Our claim is narrow. We claim to measure like what moves around those announcements. So what might be going around it in terms of safe asset demand is beyond our scope. And for trade war macro, we believe that it is important to keep in mind this uncertainty variable as it informs the variables. Thank you.
We have now Dima as a discussant.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much to organizers for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. It's a great paper, and also I think it's it's a very interesting question, right? So the question is, what explains the dollar depreciation in 2025? So I think economists are kind of famous for not being very good at forecasts, but at least usually after things happen, we are very good at explaining them. And this is one of the cases where it's a bit embarrassing, right? Even after these things happened, I don't think there is still consensus. So let me skip this. So let me just start maybe with a background, right? Just a few theories that have been proposed. It's not exclusive list clearly, and I mean there's much work still going on, but just kind of as a starting point, right? So one very natural explanation to potential explanation for the dollar depreciation is just that markets expected retaliation by other countries, right? And the kind of the key challenge here is that so far it didn't really materialize that much, and in the end, I mean it's probably true that markets anticipated much more retaliation that actually happened. So we would expect dollar to recover at least to some extent afterwards. Another story is that it all comes from convenience yields, right? That somehow US assets, equity, or treasuries, they become less appealing to investors. The problem is that all these things, again, they kind of recovered, right? The stock market went up a lot and maybe for other reasons, but then you look at treasuries and again, right, the yields, they kind of calmed down, they went down, and still we see this persistent depreciation in the dollar. So there is also an interesting literature which thinks about role of monetary policy. Maybe it's not so much about real exchange rate, but it's all driven by nominal exchange rate and monetary policy reaction to the tariff shock. I think again there has been much progress understanding what should be the optimal policy in such circumstances. There is a question again how much markets expected interest rates to go up or down, right? On the one hand, the shock can be inflationary. On the other hand, it can lead to recession. So that's a bit ambiguous. And also empirically, again, if we look at the expectations of the markets about future interest rates, they kind of recovered afterwards. So there are other explanations. I mean, Tarek has a great, agenda, interesting ideas about just changing pass-through of US shocks into global SDF, right? So there are other explanations, but all of these stories, they have this problem that how can we kind of rationalize the fact that dollar depreciated on impact, but didn't recover afterwards. And so this is where this paper comes in, and it proposes another story, right? That it's all driven by risk premium. So in that sense, if it's a very persistent financial shock, it can generate quite persistent depreciation of the currency. Okay, so let me start with the theory. So I will go through theory and empirics and try to make some comments. So the model is very simple, right? It's a very basic model, which I feel very lucky about. I saw other papers by Shabnam and co-authors, and in the past these were kind of huge models with a lot of countries, a lot of input-output linkages, sticky price, etc. So my job was much easier because it's a simple two-country model, two goods, call-option preferences, segmented financial markets, and the monetary policy here just stabilizes CPI, so nominal and real exchange rate just equal to each other. Okay, so they have two main theoretical results. The first one is kind of negative, right? So they argue that valuation effects cannot explain the depreciation. And so let me start with that. I think, there is
I think, very simple intuition for this result. And then there is, one non-trivial thing, and this is where the paper is really useful. So, okay, if you just think in terms of permanent tariffs, then you can see this point almost immediately, right? So again, you can aggregate trade balances across periods, right? You have some initial net foreign asset position, right, which you can decompose into, gross assets and gross liabilities. Most of US gross assets, they're in foreign currency. Most of US liabilities, they're in dollars. So you need to convert them into the same units using the exchange rate. And because of that, depreciation of the exchange rate generates a positive valuation effect for the US, right? It's kind of deflates away the debt of the US. So once you have this equation, it's kind of immediate, right? That if you increase tariffs, that exchange rate needs to move in the opposite direction. Exchange rate needs to appreciate, and it's completely independent of this gross positions as long as both B star and B are positive, right? So for permanent tariff, I would argue the intuition is very clear, right? And it kind of follows immediately. So what is non-trivial, and this is where the contribution of the paper is that this result still holds no matter how persistent the tariff shock is, right? That, even though you kind of have changes in the interest rates, which change the slope in the UIP, you still get this result. Okay, now more importantly, so what is kind of the main positive theoretical results? So here's kind of the arbitrageur's problem, right? Again, it's a model with segmented markets. So think of D and D star as liabilities of households in two countries in their corresponding currencies. And so all these international capital flows, they have to go through these intermediaries, right? Just like in Gabay-Maggiore model. And so then once you solve this problem, given this mean variance preferences, you get a modified UIP condition. So you have this convenience yield psi, and then you have this risk premium, okay, which is proportional to the volatility of the exchange rate. Now, so the key question here is that why is it the case that sigma square enters with this particular sign, right? If you start just with kind of symmetric model, if everything is symmetric, there is no reason why high uncertainty should depreciate the dollar rather than other currencies. So in the model, this effect comes from this normalization, right? So this is the risk aversion parameter psi, and the way it is written, it is normalized by D. Okay, and so in implicit assumption here that D is positive, right? Because if D is negative, then you have non-concave preferences. Actually, there is no interior solution, right? So the assumption here is that you have that this arbitrageurs they take long positions in the dollar. And in principle, you can use different approximations to get the same result, but this assumption is there always. So if your view of the world is that there are US intermediaries, right? They issue these liabilities in dollars for foreigners, and then they invest in foreign assets. So that will not work, right? Because then they are short in dollars, they are not long in dollars. So that doesn't work. So you can think of this as maybe foreign intermediaries, right? Foreign intermediaries, what they do, they issue, they borrow in foreign currency, and then they invest in US assets. So that would work. I mean, there's an interesting question. We usually think that financial markets, they're mostly, these intermediaries, they're more likely to be in the US than in other countries, but that can be one explanation. Another interpretation is that maybe we should focus more on net positions, right? Given that US liabilities are larger than US assets, then maybe, we should just focus on that part. And so then these intermediates, again, they kind of borrow in dollars, right? Sorry, they lend in dollars to local households. So they borrow in foreign currency and they lend to local households in dollars. So you can tell different stories. You can come up with the different situations where this works. And as Rohan said yesterday in his presentation, right? Maybe it's completely unrelated to NFA. Maybe it just comes from some noise traders demand and not household demand. The question, of course, that it raises is why didn't we see dollar depreciating in the previous risk-off episodes, right? Why usually it was the case that dollar appreciated, not depreciated? Is it because that maybe these positions changed over time, right? Maybe, again, somehow the US has now larger liabilities than in the past, or something else changed, right? And again, we're probably, we're probably interested to make some forecast about the future. So what will happen in the next episode? And so that's, I think, that an interesting thing that the authors can think more thoroughly given their framework. Okay, so then, this is again the same UIP condition. Now let's put it into general equilibrium. So there is, the country's budget constraint with trade balance, which depends on relative demand, on expenditure switching, and on tariffs and market clearing condition, right? And so tariffs, the level of tariffs enters into these two conditions. That's what John said, right? Like the tariffs is kind of directly they appear in the goods markets, and then kind of indirectly they can also move convenience yields and volatility of the exchange rate in financial markets. And then they have this, Euler equation, which is slightly different from the standard one because they have this extra term here, right? They actually use Cara utility for domestic households. And the reason they want this, at least kind of my reading of the paper, is that so when they think about comparative statics, okay, so for level of tariffs, it's clear, right? The exchange rate needs to appreciate, and that increases interest rates. For convenience yields, you get depreciation of the currency and increase in interest rates. But then for tariff uncertainty, right, for the second moment shock, they want depreciation, and then they also want kind of zero effect on the interest rate. I think this is kind of comes from the empirical findings. And so, having both second moment shocks in the UIP and also in the Euler equation helps them to get this zero effect. Again, I'm not completely sure it is so important in the end. It's a flexible price model. All these effects on the interest rates, they're proportional to the openness of the economy, right? And so given that US is a relatively closed economy and the rest of the world it will be relatively closed, I think to the first order, all these free shocks, the second moment shock, the convenience shock, and the tariff shock, they only affect international flows, right? And so they will have small effects on the interest rates. So, I'm not super concerned, whether there is positive sign or negative sign, because I think in the end it will be just a very small thing. Now, another thing here is, right, so what about convenience yield? I think the main identification will just come from the fact that the authors will measure this convenience yields using CIP in the data, right? And they just show that these things are zero, so it kind of, again, doesn't matter what is the sign of this effect. Now, kind of, to be fair to the, other literature, so there are other ways of thinking about convenience yields, right? So like the papers by Zheng Yang and co-authors. So usually, sometimes at least, people think of convenience yields as some returns on assets by both home investors and foreign investors. And that would be very different, right? Because then, even if we take the limit of closed economy, these convenience yields, they will move interest rates. So that's kind of just, again, it's a semantic issue, but just to be clear that there are different ways of thinking about these convenience yields. Okay, so now the main part of the paper, right? So the empirical evidence, and this is where I think, paper makes most progress. So the way the paper thinks about this, and again, I think John was very clear about this, right? So you have this kind of treatments, right? There's kind of random announcements. There are some days, some hours when these announcements arrive. And these announcements, it's kind of a basket of shocks. It's not just one shock, it's effectively a basket, this combination of tau, increasing the average tariff, change in the tariff volatility, and then the change in this convenience yields. Okay, so and on different realizations, on different announcement dates, you can have very different combinations of these three different shocks. And then the authors want to see how this, through these three channels, these announcements affect exchange rates, interest rates, and other outcomes. Anyway, so they built a new data set. And okay, so as a first step, right? Okay, I should say one more thing. So how do they measure uncertainty? Again, John said this. So they just look at the implied volatility of the exchange rate from options and VIX, right? This is it's hard to observe directly in the data how much uncertainty there is about tariffs, so that's kind of their proxy. And in the end, it's very much consistent with the theory, right? In the theory, it's exactly the change in the volatility of the exchange rate which matters. Okay, so here's the first summary table, and then I think the results here are already quite impressive. So you take this announcement's days and you classify them based on whether tau moved up or down and whether sigma squared went up or down, right? And okay, so this is just kind of the definition. So this is the numbers that you would expect to get the size. But here's the most interesting thing, right? So if you look at these four numbers here, and you compare whether exchange rate depreciated or appreciated, what you will see is that it depreciated when sigma went up, and it appreciated when sigma went down, right? And so it is kind of independent from the change in the first moment. That is very surprising. No, I mean, I would not expect that before I read the paper. It's true, of course, that in the end there are especially for some combinations of shocks, there are few observations, so the confidence interval is pretty large. But it's an interesting thing that it's exactly the second moment which moves the exchange rate in the right direction, kind of generates this depreciation. So as I said, right, for the CIP wedge, for the convenience yields, it's just zero. So we can kind of forget about that shock and completely ignore it. Okay, so then you can say that maybe it's always the case that sigma squared, like the volatility of the exchange rate, moves the exchange rate, but maybe it's not really related to tariffs. right? I mean, the volatility of exchange rate moves for many different reasons. And so this is where this figure is really important, right? So if you look at the non-announcement days, right, non-event days, there are still changes in sigma square, right, volatility of the exchange rate, but it is not systematically associated with movements in the exchange rate. It doesn't lead to systematic depreciations. It's only on the announcements dates, right? And that's kind of interesting. So so why is that? Why? How can it happen in the model? Well, because other shocks which drive sigma square, right, the volatility of the exchange rate, they probably also have direct effect on the exchange rate. So that kind of contaminates confounds the effect. Okay, so then this is kind of now the formal analysis, right? So you put all these three kind of channels into the regression, and you see how much they affect the exchange rate, right? And so you can see again, unfortunately, there are not so many observations left, but so there's, for example, large uncertainty about psi, but we already saw that psi is very small anyway. So the key driver comes from the volatility in the exchange rate, right? The second moment, and that's what explains the depreciation of the currency. Okay, so in the interest of time, let me skip this and just make two last comments. So the first one is, what can be the threats of amplification, right? I think, again, first of all, I think these are very impressive results. That's not what I expected, but in principle, if you try hard, you can, of course, come up with some amplification issues. So one can be that something like, there are other shocks, something like financial meltdown, which depreciates the currency, increases volatility. And then, there's kind of the Stacko effect that Trump gets really nervous, right? He wants to stabilize financial markets, and so he kind of retreats and decreases some tariffs, right? You can imagine things like that. Again, you need these things to happen, at very high frequency, right? Which is, very, very, I guess, unlikely, but that can be one story. Another one is that, so is this really exclusive list of channels? You can imagine, again, that maybe there are other ways for which other mechanisms for which tariffs affect exchange rates, right? Maybe, again, as going back to my very first slide, maybe through monetary policy, changes in productivity of the tradable sector, retaliation. And so maybe that moves the exchange rate, and then the sigma square is just a kind of a sideshow, right? Right, so that's again, it's more about the particular channel. So one last comment, and I'm done. So if the last part of the paper, I think this is, the last one, I think it's still very much in progress, where they go back and think about how to interpret these empirical estimates using the GE model. So I think ideally the paper should go back to the original question, right? So we see these changes in sigma square, we see changes in the exchange rate volatility. How much of the total dollar depreciation can we explain using these particular shocks, right? So, okay, we have these estimates from the regressions, but now let's kind of accumulate all this over this period. And one important point here is that, so the paper emphasizes that implied persistence of the tariff shocks, the first moments, right, was not high enough. But what about persistence of the sigma square? It seems like it should play a crucial role, right? Again, if it's just IID shock here, it will not move exchange rate very persistently. It will have small effects. So it looks like you also need persistent increase in the volatility of the exchange rate driven by the persistence change in tariffs. Okay, so let me stop here. Yeah, very interesting paper.
Let's open to questions. Jesse?
And I'd be really curious to know if you could use the text you got from the announcements to dig a little deeper, in the sense that you could imagine that if President Trump announces a large tariff on a huge set of countries, that's potentially big enough to move the US price level, but a rant against a tiny country, economically probably only can signal stuff about the future stance and reliability of the United States. And so it'd be interesting to dig in. And related, I'd be really curious, given the data you have on these kind of bilateral announcements, I'd be really interested to see if all these announcements are causing kind of a common movement in the US dollar against kind of the set of all currencies, the way that the cross section usually moves, like Rohan and Moritz talked about yesterday, or if the pattern is when President Trump announces big tariffs on Colombia, you have the bilateral exchange rate of the dollar and the peso moving, in the way that just a standard tariff shock moves, but then you have the movement of the dollar against everybody else kind of moving in your uncertainty channels.
The macro implications of tariffs in models at least tend to depend a lot on the monetary policy rule. I know you have flexible prices here, but if your studies on the nominal exchange rate policy rule probably still could matter. In particular, I'm wondering the model's assumption of strict CPI inflation targeting is working against your result. So for example, if tariffs lead to import price inflation, then strict CPI targeting would call for monetary action, which works against your result. And similarly, you have other mechanisms that help the currency to depreciate. Again, that leads to import price inflation, and the monetary policy rule is going to work against your result. So I wonder if maybe replacing your assumption with a PPI targeting might make it even easier to get your result or amplify it. That is, allowing some CPI inflation might help you get currency depreciation. And the PPI targeting also would have the benefit of being closer to what's likely to be the optimal policy in this case.
I'll start with those.
Give me a couple more. Brent?
Wondered if you looked at changes that were relevant for the IEPA court case. It's like when there was a Court of International Trade decision or the opening arguments at the Supreme Court, or a bunch of things that would act like a global shock. So might be also interested about that.
I'll start with those three. Is that okay? So excellent suggestions. Some of our data work is ongoing because we just had our Bloomberg license issues resolved last week. So we will do that. We have not looked into it. To the original question about other currencies, the short answer is the DXY, like broad dollar index minus euro. But to your point, we do intend to look at like, does Colombia's rate move right? That is something we will document, and that's super helpful. On the text of the announcements, this actually allows me to clarify something super important. When we encode the tariff rate, that tariff rate isn't just on, like, say I put 10% on semiconductors. What enters the regression is not 10%. What we look at is what was the share of semiconductors in the basket. So we multiply it by that. So some of what you're thinking is already in the regression, but we will try richer specifications. So we let, for example, the regression tell us where that coefficient would likely go rather than us disciplining it. That's something we will do, and we really appreciate that comment. On the monetary policy, we really appreciate that question because we did look into it in the bigger tariff network paper. That one had nominal rigidities. We did encode a UIP shock like this. So in some ways, here we're doing the micro foundations of the asset market shock that was already in that paper. Here, because we're in a flex price setting, none of the real outcomes we're interested in would change based on the policy rule. You're exactly correct, though, on things that we're interested in terms of nominal. So, for example, nominal stock prices here are mechanically affected by the pricing rule. So we can see what that solution looks like under different policy rules for sure. But we do have the bigger actual stickiness. How does the response differ by policy rule in last year's big network paper? It's a really good question. And I think that's about it on my end.
So I wanted to connect the paper with the last paper presented yesterday evening in the ITM session, which was about tariff front running. So basically, what happened with all of these announcements, some of them took a long time to crystallize. It was not clear, what the rates will be for a very long time, and some of them took even a year long to implement it. So the evidence seems to be that a lot of the importers actually rushed to provision a lot of the tariffs, the goods that were impacted by the tariffs, and actually that could be, it could be a differentiation. So have you thought about incorporating this tariff front running into your analysis?
So in the big, in the big tariff paper, we did allow for the possibility of tariffs being announced for the future, and depending on the parameters, you could incorporate that into this model too. You don't necessarily always get depreciation in this framework from that channel alone, because agents are simply moving forward what they would have done anyway. So there's a little bit of intertemporal substitution, but that alone in this framework doesn't get us, at least as far as we've simulated in that context, with a richer model, that depreciation. It's possible, and we'll think about other types of extensions though.
Very nice paper. I like Dima's comment on isolating the risk premium channel, and I have a suggestion. So I think there's something unique about risk premium, which is that it has a factor structure, especially in the currency world. Many people in this room have worked on it. So, for example, if you think about a dollar factor, different countries would have heterogeneous loadings on it. And to a big extent, that's something we can predict ex ante. So if you look at the cross-section of currencies, if their response is different in a predictable way, I think that would be a very kind of convincing evidence for the risk premium channel, as opposed to a different channel which would only appreciate the dollar unilaterally against all other currencies.
That is something for sure we will do. I'll take 1 minute to actually thank Dima for those comments. They're super helpful. I think we should, just on the very last one, we do a decomposition. The reason we didn't show it is because you're targeting regression moments. Loosely, you recover whatever the Shapley share was in the target moments. So we didn't want to say 80% of depreciation is uncertainty, just because it's sort of from a targeted moment. But we will think about that in a more structured manner to do a proper decomposition.
Yeah, just 2 quick comments. I mean, some countries retaliated, like China, and to a certain extent Canada as well. I'm wondering, you know, if you looked at those examples, anyway, that affected those bilateral exchange rates. The second one is that, as far as I understand, your model kind of embeds in terms of trade advantage for the tariff setup for the US. Now, if we look at the data from me, Weinstein, and other co-authors, it doesn't seem like there was any terms of trade gain at all. So that, you know, that would affect the degree of required appreciation, because, you know, the US actually didn't have that appreciation term.
Both excellent points on.
Can I?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, just to, because independently of the retaliation, when the US, when Trump was doing this one to show like this, I mean, China was also announcing that they were going to increase their tariffs. Could also include the announcement from the countries on which Trump is announcing that they will increase the tariff, and then China is, there is some sort of announcement retaliation because China announced that they will increase the tariff as well. And maybe nothing happened, or maybe the tariff uncertainty increased even more because both countries do announce that something will happen.
So I'll start with that comment. We did document as many retaliation entries as we could. The partial issue is a lot of them happen around US trading hours, and then there aren't a lot of them. But we will look into it, because what would be really nice, exactly as you said, is you show the other side of it. And I began the presentation with retaliation gets you depreciation. So you could also show some share of it was from that. The bilateral exchange rate comment also agree, same with the earlier comment. We will look into it. On the terms of trade, part of what happened in real life data is twofold. One, you have slow pass-through because tariffs actually have to go through importers. That's something, again, we look in the big network paper where we do a sector that's just importing. The other part is actually the channel we identify, which is when rho is low, when I don't think it's really going to stick around, that terms of trade channel dampens. So it's exactly actually consistent with that idea.
Coefficients are basically input of the average, so when you get the distribution of pass-through, and some are less than 1, some are greater than 1. So there's some terms of trade effects going on, but they're in the cross-section products. That means not on the full distribution effects.
We agree. There is a dispersion, but we think overall this is sort of thinking of the economy as one good. So in the aggregate, as it washes out, part of it washing out is the persistence and credibility, we believe.
All right. Thank you very much to everyone for an engaging session. Looking forward to see you tomorrow.